Okay, so picture this. You've really poured your heart and soul into a project, feeling pretty good about how it's going.
Yeah.
And then a colleague kind of subtly suggests that they were actually the driving force behind like your key contributions. Or maybe you thought you were following your manager's instructions perfectly clear.
Yeah.
Only to find out you completely missed the mark.
Oh, no.
And now you're stuck trying to fix the whole mess.
Yeah, I've been there.
Workplace conflicts, right?
Definitely.
It feels like everyone goes through them at some point.
Yeah, it's pretty universal in any professional setting.
And, for anyone who's navigating these situations in English,
Right.
especially in today's global work environment, it can add a whole extra layer of, complexity.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What might seem like just a straightforward disagreement on the surface can become so much more complicated when you think about different communication styles, cultural differences in how people approach conflict. And then you have the potential for just misunderstandings based on language barriers.
Exactly. So for this deep dive, we've got a really great resource.
Okay.
It's a guide that's designed to help advanced English learners.
Right.
Like, you handle these inevitable workplace conflicts with confidence and professionalism.
I like it.
So think of this like a personal behind-the-scenes look
Yeah.
at how to navigate disagreements, keep those professional relationships strong, and most importantly, make sure your perspective is heard and understood.
That's key.
Our conversation today draws from this really comprehensive guide.
Yes.
It goes beyond just surface-level advice and digs into the roots of what workplace conflict is really about.
Yeah, it gets to the heart of it.
And then it gives us these very practical strategies that you can start using right away.
Love that actionable advice.
So our mission for this deep dive is to help you understand why professionalism is so important when you're working through these disagreements.
Absolutely.
We'll break down the essential communication skills, walk you through a step-by-step framework you can actually apply in real life.
Like it.
And then we'll even explore how to navigate some of those really common conflict scenarios we all face.
Sounds good to me.
And all of this with a focus on how to communicate effectively in English to get the best outcome.
Excellent.
Okay, so first things first, workplace conflicts, they're just part of the deal, right?
Yeah, they're pretty much inevitable.
Yeah.
Anytime you have people working together, you're bound to have different opinions,
Right.
different approaches, especially when deadlines are looming
Yeah.
and the pressure is on.
Totally. And like you said earlier, how you handle these conflicts, it really reflects on you as a professional.
It does. It shows your ability to collaborate, to solve problems, and to maintain respectful relationships, even when things get a bit tense.
Yeah, even when you want to scream.
Exactly. And for non-native English speakers, it can feel like there's an added challenge
Right.
trying to get your point across clearly, while also being super aware of potential language or cultural misunderstandings.
Totally. So this guide we've been looking at,
Yes.
it breaks workplace conflicts down into a few main categories,
Okay.
which I think is a helpful way to understand what's really going on in these situations.
I agree. Categorization is really helpful.
So first up, we have interpersonal conflicts.
All right.
What's at the heart of those?
Well, interpersonal conflicts are those clashes that happen between people.
Oh, okay.
They often come up because of personality differences, conflicting work styles, or sometimes it's as simple as a misunderstanding. Imagine two team members who just always seem to butt heads.
Right.
Maybe they have totally opposite communication preferences.
Oh, yeah, I've definitely seen that.
The guide also points out this really common scenario where people disagree about who deserves credit for a project.
Oh, that's tough.
Right? Those situations can get really emotional if they aren't handled carefully.
Absolutely. So next we have task-related conflicts. This sounds like it's more focused on the work itself.
You got a task-related conflicts are those disagreements that revolve around how the work is actually getting done.
Okay.
So we're talking about disagreements about processes,
Right.
timelines, or individual responsibilities.
Okay.
A classic example is when a team can't agree on how to prioritize their work.
Oh, yeah, that can be a nightmare.
It can lead to frustration, bottlenecks,
Yeah.
and missed deadlines. So here, the conflict is less about personalities clashing
Okay.
and more about different ideas about how to reach those shared goals.
Makes sense. And the last category
Yes.
is leadership conflicts. This one seems pretty self-explanatory.
It is. It involves tensions that come up between employees and their managers,
Right.
or anyone in a position of authority.
Okay.
This could be because of disagreements about decisions, the level of supervision, or even different opinions about the overall strategy.
Got it.
The guide gives an example of an employee who feels micromanaged, which can definitely lead to conflict.
Definitely.
And hurt morale.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we've got these different types of conflicts, but what are some of the root causes of these disagreements in the first place?
Well, the guide highlights several common reasons why these conflicts happen.
Okay.
Poor communication is a big one.
Makes sense.
If people aren't expressing themselves clearly or actively listening to each other, misunderstandings are bound to pop up.
Yeah.
Another culprit is unclear roles and responsibilities.
Okay.
When people aren't sure what they're supposed to be doing or where their responsibilities begin and end, it can lead to overlap and conflict.
Totally. And then you have competing priorities within a team or between different departments.
Absolutely.
Which can create friction.
For sure.
And we can't forget about cultural differences. Different communication styles and expectations can also lead to conflict.
Definitely. And let's not underestimate the impact of stress and heavy workloads. When people are feeling overwhelmed, they're more likely to be short-tempered and less patient.
True. It's interesting how many of these causes come down to a lack of clarity or alignment.
Yeah, I think you're right about that.
So recognizing the type of conflict you're dealing with and understanding its potential root causes seems like the first step towards resolving it effectively.
Absolutely. It's like diagnosing a medical condition before you try to treat it.
Oh, I like that analogy.
It lets you target your approach and fix the underlying problems instead of just dealing with the symptoms.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so we've established that conflicts are pretty much inevitable.
Yeah, they're part of life.
But this guide really emphasizes the importance of professionalism in how we handle them.
Right.
So in the context of a workplace disagreement, what does it actually mean to act professionally?
Well, professionalism in conflict resolution is all about managing disagreements respectfully, constructively, and without those emotional outbursts. It's about keeping your cool and focusing on a positive outcome instead of making things worse or pointing fingers.
I like it. And the guide breaks down professionalism into a few key aspects.
Right.
Let's start with remaining calm.
Okay.
Which I know can be tough when you feel strongly about something.
Oh, it definitely can be, especially when you're passionate about your viewpoint.
Yeah.
Or you feel like you've been treated unfairly.
Right.
But it's super important to consciously avoid raising your voice.
Okay.
Using aggressive language or letting your emotions take over.
Yeah.
Staying calm helps de-escalate the situation and creates an environment where you can have a rational discussion.
That makes sense. What about being objective? How do we try to set aside our personal feelings when things get heated?
Being objective is about focusing on the facts.
Okay.
And not letting your emotions or biases cloud your judgment.
Right.
So try to analyze the situation from a neutral perspective.
Yeah.
Consider all the evidence and resist the urge to make assumptions.
Okay.
Or take things personally.
Tough, but important.
It is. And, we tend to have this confirmation bias where we only focus on the evidence that supports our own view.
Yeah, that's so true.
A quick way to combat that is to actively seek out and consider the strongest argument against your position.
Oh, that's interesting. I've never thought about it that way.
It forces you to step outside your own perspective.
Yeah. That's a really helpful tip.
Right.
Okay, another key aspect of professionalism is respecting differences.
Absolutely.
And in today's global workplaces, this seems especially important.
It's crucial. You have to acknowledge that people have different opinions. Different perspectives and different communication styles.
Yeah.
Even if you fundamentally disagree with someone. Right?
You can still respect their right to have that opinion and engage in a respectful conversation.
Exactly. And this is where cultural sensitivity comes in.
Okay.
Which we'll talk more about later.
Sounds good. And finally, professionalism in conflict resolution means seeking solutions.
Right.
It's not about being right or winning the argument, is it?
No. The main goal should be to find a solution everyone can agree on.
Right.
A compromise where everyone feels like their concerns have been heard and addressed.
Yeah.
So it's about working together to solve the problem, not competing against each other.
Got it. So we've got the foundation. Now we understand the different types of conflicts and why professionalism is so important in how we handle them. So let's get to the practical stuff.
Okay.
The communication skills that can really make a difference in the outcome of a conflict.
Yeah, those are key.
The guide really stresses the importance of active listening.
Absolutely.
So in a conflict situation, what does active listening actually involve?
Active listening is more than just hearing the words.
Okay.
It's about focusing on the message, trying to understand their perspective.
Right.
Responding thoughtfully to show you understand.
Yeah.
And actually remembering what they said.
Okay.
When you actively listen in a conflict, you're telling the other person that you value their opinion. Right. And you're making a real effort to see things from their side.
That makes sense. And the guide gives us some do's and don'ts for active listening.
Yeah.
What are some things we should be doing?
One of the most important do's is paraphrasing.
Okay.
Which means putting what you heard into your own words.
Right.
To make sure you got it right.
So it's like saying...
Exactly.
So what I'm hearing is you feel like the timeline was too tight. Is that correct?
Exactly. That's a great example.
Okay.
That simple clarifying question can prevent so many misunderstandings.
Yeah.
And it shows the other person that you're really paying attention.
Makes sense. What are some things we should avoid doing?
The big don'ts are interrupting.
Okay.
And planning your response while the other person's still talking.
Right.
Active listening means being present. And focusing on what they're saying.
Okay.
Not just waiting for your turn to talk.
Got it. Another key communication skill is assertive communication.
Yes.
How is that different from being aggressive?
Assertive communication is about expressing your needs, opinions, and feelings directly and respectfully.
Okay.
Without being aggressive or passive.
Got it.
It's about standing up for yourself.
Right.
While still respecting the other person.
So how do we do that?
The guide suggests using I statements.
Okay.
Which are really helpful in conflict situations.
Why is that?
Because I statements let you express your feelings from your own perspective.
Yeah.
Without blaming the other person.
Okay.
By focusing on how you feel.
Right.
Not what they did wrong.
Okay.
You're less likely to make them defensive.
Makes sense.
And more likely to have a productive conversation.
Got it.
So instead of saying, you never listen to my ideas.
Oh, yeah.
You can say, I feel like my suggestions aren't being considered. Can we talk about this?
Much better.
Right? It's a subtle shift in language.
Yeah.
But it makes a big difference.
Absolutely. The guide also talks about nonverbal communication.
Right.
We often focus so much on the words, but our body language and tone of voice can communicate just as much.
Oh, for sure. Sometimes even more.
Right.
Our nonverbal cues can either support or contradict what we're saying.
So what are some things to keep in mind?
Eye contact is important.
Okay.
You want to show you're engaged, but not stare them down.
Right.
An open posture, like uncrossing your arms, can make you seem more approachable and receptive.
Yeah.
And your tone of voice is crucial.
Right.
Even if your words are neutral.
Yeah.
A sarcastic or aggressive tone can escalate things quickly.
Totally. Aim for a calm, even neutral tone.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered the key communication skills.
Now
let's talk about a more structured approach to resolving conflicts.
Okay.
The guide outlines a 5-step strategy.
That's good.
Step 1 is stay calm and composed.
Right.
We talked about this earlier.
But
does the guide offer any specific techniques?
Yes. It recommends taking a few deep breaths before you respond to help you regulate your emotion.
Yeah.
And if things are getting too heated, it suggests taking a short break.
Right. Yeah.
You can say something like, let's take 10 minutes to cool down and then come back to this.
Simple but effective.
It is. Sometimes just pausing the conversation can completely change its direction.
What's step 2?
Step 2 is identifying the root cause of the conflict.
Okay.
So you're going beyond the immediate disagreement.
Right.
To understand what's really going on.
Yeah.
The guide says it's important to ask clarifying questions.
Okay.
Like, can you explain what specifically bothered you about the decision?
Got it.
That helps you uncover the real issues and make sure you're addressing the root cause.
Okay.
Not just the surface level stuff.
Step 3 is use neutral language.
Right.
We talked about avoiding blame with I statements.
Yes.
But this seems like it's about a broader approach to how we choose our words.
It is. Neutral language helps lower the tension.
Okay.
And avoids making people defensive. The guide says to stay away from accusatory words.
Like what?
Like always and never.
Right.
They often exaggerate the situation and make the other person feel attacked.
Okay.
So instead of saying, you always ignore my emails?
Yeah.
Try something more neutral, like, I noticed that some emails haven't received a response. Can we talk about a better way to communicate?
Yeah.
That focuses on the specific behavior without making a personal judgment.
That's a much more constructive way to approach it.
Exactly.
Step 4 is finding common ground.
Right.
How do we do that when we're in the middle of a disagreement?
Finding common ground means looking for shared goals or objectives.
Okay.
that you and the other person can both agree on.
Right.
When you highlight those shared interests, it creates a sense of collaboration.
Okay.
And reminds everyone that you're all working towards the same outcome.
That's helpful.
The guide gives an example. You could say, we both want this project to be successful. How can we align our approaches to make that happen?
I like that.
That shifts the focus away from the conflict.
Right.
And towards that shared goal.
And finally, step 5, agree on a solution.
Yes.
This is where we put the plan into action.
Right. This is where you decide on the specific actions
to
resolve the conflict and move forward.
Got it.
It's about coming up with concrete, actionable steps.
Right.
That address the root cause. And prevent the conflict from happening again.
Okay.
So the guide suggests something like, moving forward, let's have a weekly check-in to make sure we're all on the same page.
Right.
And avoid miscommunication.
That's a great example.
The key is to be specific.
Okay.
Make sure everyone understands the solution. And ideally write it down somewhere.
Document it.
Exactly.
This 5-step approach seems really useful.
I think so too.
The guide also goes into some common workplace conflict scenarios and how to apply these strategies.
Right.
So let's say you have a disagreement with a colleague. Maybe someone who always shoots down your ideas in meetings.
I've been there.
How can we use these techniques in that situation?
Well, in that case, assertive communication is key.
Okay.
Instead of getting defensive or confrontational, you could try saying something like, I'd like to understand your perspective on why you prefer a different approach. Could we maybe discuss the pros and cons of both ideas?
Okay.
That opens up a dialogue, shows that you value their opinion, while also making it clear that you want your ideas to be heard.
Makes sense. And then you actively listen to their response.
Yes.
And look for areas where you might agree or compromise.
Exactly.
What about miscommunication with a manager? That can be tricky.
It can be.
The guide talks about a situation where a manager gives unclear instructions. And it leads to mistakes.
Oh, yeah.
How do we handle that professionally?
In this case, the focus should be on preventing future miscommunications.
Okay.
You could say, to make sure I fully understand the requirements for future tasks. Would it be possible to clarify the key expectations in writing?
Got it.
That's a way to suggest a practical solution without blaming anyone.
Right.
And it benefits both of you in the long run.
Totally. And again, maintaining that calm and respectful tone is super important.
Absolutely.
What about team conflicts that happen in meetings? Those can be so disruptive.
They can derail the whole meeting.
The guide gives an example of 2 team members arguing loudly. What's a good way to step in and get things back on track?
A neutral and direct approach is usually best.
Okay.
You could say something like, let's bring the focus back to the issue. What are the main points of disagreement? And what are some solutions we can explore together? That gently steers the conversation away from personal attacks. And towards finding a solution.
And it subtly reminds everyone to be respectful.
It does.
And then there's dealing with the difficult client, which is something a lot of professionals face.
Yeah, it comes with the territory.
The guide has a scenario where a client is really upset about project delays.
Right.
How do we handle that professionally, especially when we're communicating in English?
First, you acknowledge their frustration. And sincerely apologize for the inconvenience.
Got it.
Something like, I understand your disappointment with the delay, and I sincerely apologize for the impact this has had. That shows empathy. That it's crucial to explain what you're doing to fix the situation. And to prevent it from happening again. For example, you could say, here's the revised timeline. And these are the steps we've taken to make sure we stay on track.
Makes sense.
That shows that you're taking responsibility
Right.
and committed to making things right.
These examples are so helpful.
I'm glad.
Now, the guide brings up another really important point.
Okay.
Cultural sensitivity in conflict resolution.
Yes, that's huge, especially in our globalized world.
So how do different cultural norms influence how people approach and manage conflicts?
Cultural norms play a big role in how people see conflict.
Okay.
And how they deal with it. The guide talks about the difference between direct cultures, like the US and Germany,
Right.
where open confrontation is seen as normal and even necessary.
Okay.
And indirect cultures, like Japan and India,
Right.
where avoiding public disagreement and saving face is more important.
So how do these different cultural approaches affect how we should handle conflicts with people from different backgrounds?
It means we need to be really aware of those cultural differences.
Okay.
and be ready to adapt our communication style.
Right.
So if you're dealing with someone from a more indirect culture, being too direct or confrontational,
right,
even if that's your usual style, could be seen as rude or aggressive.
Got it.
In those cases, a more subtle, diplomatic approach that focuses on the relationship might be more effective.
Makes sense.
And on the other hand, in a more direct culture, being too indirect could be seen as evasive or confusing.
So it's all about being adaptable and mindful.
Exactly, especially in cross-cultural situations.
Now, what happens when you've tried all these strategies, but you're still stuck?
Right.
The guide talks about when it might be time to escalate the conflict. What are the signs that we need to get someone else involved?
The guide says there are two main situations where escalation is definitely necessary. One, if the conflict involves harassment or discrimination, that needs to be reported to HR or management immediately.
Absolutely.
And two, if you've made a real effort to resolve the conflict yourself, but you're not getting anywhere. You've reached a dead end.
Got it. So how do we escalate a conflict professionally? We don't want to seem like we're running to someone higher up for every little disagreement.
You're right. When you do decide to escalate, it's important to be calm, objective, and stick to the facts.
Got it.
Don't blame anyone. Or exaggerate the situation. The guide suggests saying something like, I've tried to resolve this issue directly with so-and-so, but we're at an impasse. Could HR help us find a solution?
That's a good way to frame it.
It explains the situation clearly and suggests a constructive solution.
Having a neutral third party mediate.
Exactly.
So we've talked about handling conflicts when they happen.
Right.
But what about preventing them in the first place?
That's the ideal scenario, isn't it?
It is. The guide mentions some preventative strategies.
It does.
What are they?
Building strong relationships among colleagues is key. Things like small talk and team building activities can help people communicate better and understand each other, which makes conflict less likely to escalate.
Makes sense.
Another important factor is setting clear expectations from the start. Defining roles, responsibilities, and deadlines can prevent a lot of misunderstandings that lead to conflict.
And finally, encouraging open communication.
Absolutely.
Through regular feedback and opportunities for dialogue.
Yes, that's so important.
Can help address issues before they become big problems.
Exactly. It's about catching those small sparks before they turn into a fire.
Those are all really positive steps that can create a more collaborative and less conflict-prone workplace.
For sure.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the most important takeaways about handling workplace conflicts professionally?
The key principles are emotional intelligence. Clear, assertive, and respectful communication. And a focus on finding solutions. Not placing blame.
Got it.
These skills aren't just about managing disagreements. They're essential for creating a positive and productive work environment. Where everyone feels respected, valued, and heard.
Absolutely. And the guide has one final piece of advice. Specifically for advanced English learners.
I'm listening.
It says to practice key conflict resolution phrases. Well, that's a good one.
To build your confidence in using them.
Makes sense.
Can you give us a couple of examples?
Sure. Try practicing phrases like, let's see if we can find a middle ground. Or, I appreciate your perspective. Here's how I see things. That way you'll be more prepared to express yourself effectively and confidently
when a conflict comes up.
Exactly. It's like having a toolkit of diplomatic language.
I like that analogy.
Ready to go?
So it's like rehearsing for those tough conversations.
It is.
This has been such an insightful deep dive.
I agree.
It's clear that learning how to handle workplace conflicts professionally, especially when you're communicating in English in a global context, is a really valuable skill.
It is a really valuable skill.
It can make a big difference in your career.
Absolutely.
These skills can help you turn potentially negative situations into opportunities for growth. Both personally and for the team and the whole organization. So here's one final thought for you to consider.
We've talked about how important it is to understand different cultural approaches to conflict in order to resolve disagreements effectively. But think about how that same cultural awareness could also help you build stronger, more inclusive, ultimately more effective global teams.
Absolutely.
Right from the start.
It makes sense.
So what's one small change you could make in your communication style today to be more mindful of those cultural differences.
Right.
And prevent conflicts before they even happen?
That's a great question.
Yeah, that's something worth thinking about.
It is.
All right, welcome to the deep dive. We're diving deep today. You're here with us because you're looking for that edge, that extra something in your professional life.
Yeah, that kind of shortcut to just absorbing key information, and making it really work for you.
Exactly. And in today's world, it's all about effective communication, especially in English, which is, let's face it, the language of global business.
It really is. And the ability to express yourself clearly, to make an impact, that's not just a nice to have anymore. It's essential. If you want to get ahead, that is.
Absolutely. And that's what we're zeroing in on today, how to express your opinions, not just logically, but persuasively. In English, at work, no less.
Right. And we've got some top-notch material here designed specifically for advanced English speakers, people like you working in international companies facing those unique communication challenges.
So think of this as your master class, if you will, in becoming more influential, more credible.
Exactly. We're going to pull out those actionable techniques that will help you structure your arguments, use persuasive language, and really, handle any objections that come your way.
With confidence and with style. And by the end of this, you'll have the tools to really amplify your voice, boost that professional impact.
For sure.
Now, we get it. As non-native English speakers, there can be hurdles. Have you ever felt that worry about sounding unnatural?
Oh, absolutely.
Or maybe struggling to put your thoughts together in a way that feels as compelling in English as it does in your native language?
Yeah, it's like, you know what you want to say, but then
it gets lost in translation.
Kind of, yeah. That hesitation in speaking up during debates, or maybe, leaning too much on cautious language, those are all things we've probably experienced.
Yeah, we're going to tackle them head on.
And let's be clear, mastering this stuff, it's not just some fluffy skill. In the corporate world, this is a game changer.
It really is. Think about it. The ability to communicate logically and persuasively, it impacts everything.
Oh, totally. Building trust with those higher-ups, influencing big decisions, your career trajectory, even your relationships at work.
It all comes down to communication. When you can express your ideas clearly with conviction, you're more likely to be heard.
Absolutely. Your suggestions, they carry more weight. You can actually shape the outcome.
And again, we understand those unique challenges you face. It's normal to be very conscious of your phrasing,
To feel like it takes more effort to build that solid argument in English.
So let's get practical. How do you build that strong foundation for your arguments?
Well, there's this framework, and it's so effective, the PRP method.
Okay, PRP, break it down for us.
PRP. Easy to remember, right? Point, reason, example, and point again.
So you bookend it with your main point. Clever.
Yeah, it's a really straightforward way to bring structure to your thoughts.
Structure is key, right?
Yeah.
It's all about making it easy for your listener to follow.
Exactly. So you start with your point. You state your main idea, nice and clear. Then you move on to the reason. Why do you think that way? You got to give a reason.
So you back it up. You don't just say, 'cause I said so.
Exactly. And then the example. Here's where you bring in the concrete evidence, a specific example to illustrate your point.
Make it real, make it tangible.
And finally, you circle back. You restate your point, but this time it's stronger because you've got that reason and that example behind it.
I like it. It's a neat package. And you know what? The material we're using, it has a great example. Let's say you're in a team meeting.
Oh, yeah. Classic.
And you want to propose a shift in the company's marketing. How would you use PRP?
All right. So your point. Let's say you want to move more of the budget towards digital advertising. You'd say something like, I believe we should shift more of our marketing budget to digital ads. Straightforward, right?
Boom. Gets to the point.
Then, your reason? You could say, because our analytics show that 70% of our target audience engages more with online content.
Data. You're bringing the receipts.
Exactly. It's not just your opinion, it's based on something solid. And then to illustrate, you bring in the example.
The real world proof.
You could say, for instance, our last LinkedIn campaign had a 20% higher conversion rate than print ads. You're showing them, hey, this actually works.
Love it. It's persuasive, right? You're not just talking, you're showing them the results.
And finally, to wrap it all up, you restate your point. That's why reallocating resources to digital platforms would maximize our ROI.
You've brought it full circle.
And now it's not just an idea, it's a solid proposal backed by evidence.
Exactly. And, the material also highlights some really, really helpful tips to make this even more effective.
Oh, let's hear it.
First off, get to the point. Don't beat around the bush. Those hesitant phrases, well, I was thinking.
Yeah, those are killers.
Skip them. Start strong. Make a clear statement.
Be confident. Own it.
Then, data and examples. We talked about this, but it's so important. It makes your argument credible.
Hard to argue with hard numbers.
Right.
And finally, keep it concise. Nobody wants to listen to a rambling explanation.
No time for that. Get to the point, support it, reiterate, and boom, you're done.
Exactly. Clarity and conciseness, they go hand in hand with that strong logical argument.
Now, let's talk about making your words really count. Persuasive language. This is where things get interesting.
This is where you add that extra oomph. It's not just about what you say, but how you say it.
The source material talks about power words. What are those exactly?
Think of them as, phrases that have more authority. They sound more objective. Instead of saying, I think, you could say, evidence suggests.
Ooh, that's good.
It adds weight,
Yeah.
It shifts it from your personal opinion to something more solid.
Like you've got research backing you up.
Exactly. Research shows is another good one. Or our analysis reveals.
These make it sound like you've done your homework.
And then there are phrases that project confidence, like this strategy ensures.
I like that. Ensures. It's strong.
Yeah, it sounds much more certain than saying this might potentially help.
So it's about being assertive.
You're right.
You're projecting that confidence in your proposals.
And that brings us to another powerful tool, rhetorical questions.
Rhetorical questions. Now, how do those work in a professional setting?
They're surprisingly effective. They engage your audience, make them think. You're not really asking for an answer, you're leading them down a certain path.
Give us an example.
Okay, so instead of saying this process is inefficient, you could ask, wouldn't it be more efficient to automate this?
Makes you think, right?
Or if you want to highlight cost savings, you could ask, what if we could reduce costs by 15% with this approach?
It's subtle, but it plants that seed in their mind.
And that makes them more receptive to your ideas.
Clever. Next up, we have something called the rule of three. Sounds intriguing.
The rule of three, it's a classic. Basically, ideas presented in sets of three are more memorable, more impactful.
Like location, location, location.
Exactly. Mind, body, and spirit.
It sticks with you.
So when you're outlining benefits or, the advantages of something, try to group them in threes.
Okay, give us a workplace example.
So instead of saying, this software is beneficial, you could say, this software is faster, cheaper, and more secure.
It just sounds better, doesn't it? More complete.
And it's easier to remember. And finally, we have the use of contrasting ideas.
Contrasting ideas. Explain that one.
It's a way to highlight the good stuff about your proposal by comparing it to something else, usually the current situation or a less appealing option.
So you make yours look better by comparison.
Exactly. Instead of just saying option B saves time, you could say, well, option A is slow and costly. Option B saves time and money.
You're highlighting the drawbacks of one and the advantages of the other.
It makes your argument more persuasive, more balanced. You're showing both sides.
Okay, so we've talked about structure, we've talked about persuasive language, but what happens when someone pushes back? Objections. How do you handle those gracefully?
The dreaded objections. But you know what? They're a natural part of the process. You got to be prepared for them.
Because you're not always going to get a yes right away.
Exactly. Even if you have the best idea, you need to be able to handle those objections.
The source material mentions a technique called acknowledge before refuting. I like that. Tell me more.
It's all about validating the other person's viewpoint before you present your counter-argument. You show them you've heard them, you understand their concerns.
So you're building that rapport, you're not just dismissing them.
Right. For example, if someone says they prefer the current system, you could say, I understand why you'd prefer the current system, but consider that the new software reduces errors by 30%.
You acknowledge their feelings, but then you bring in the hard facts.
And that makes them more open to hearing your perspective. Another technique is the yes and technique.
Yes and? What's that about?
It's similar to acknowledging, but you're building on their idea instead of refuting it. You're moving the conversation forward together.
I like that. Collaboration.
So if someone says, our offline campaign's been very successful, instead of saying, but digital is better, you could say, yes, and we can integrate those offline campaigns with digital efforts for even wider reach.
You're taking their idea and expanding on it.
Exactly. And lastly, preparation is key.
Yeah.
Think about potential objections in advance.
So you're not caught off guard.
Have your responses ready, back them up with data. If someone says, this is too risky, you could say, actually, our pilot test showed a 95% success rate, minimizing the risk.
You come prepared with the facts and figures.
It shows you've thought it through.
So we've covered structure, persuasive language, and handling objections, but communication is not one size fits all, is it?
No way. It's got to be adapted to different situations.
Yeah.
What works in a team meeting might not work in a client negotiation.
So let's break it down. Let's start with team meetings. What are some key things to keep in mind?
In team meetings, got to be concise. Time is precious, and everyone wants to be heard. PREP is your friend here.
Get to the point, back it up, keep it moving.
And don't be afraid to interject politely. A simple, if I may add, can go a long way.
Be respectful, but make sure your voice is heard. Now, what about client negotiations? That's a whole different ballgame.
Totally. Here, it's all about benefits, not features. Focus on what's in it for them.
Show them how you can solve their problems, meet their needs.
Instead of saying, this has 3 service tiers, you could say, this flexible pricing model allows you to scale your service to your needs, so you only pay for what you use.
It's about tailoring your message to their specific needs.
And then we have presentations to senior management. That could be nerve-wracking.
High stakes. What are the keys to success there?
Speak their language. They care about the big picture, the strategy, the ROI.
The bottom line.
Connect your proposal to the company's goals. Quantify the benefits. Instead of just describing a project, you could say, this initiative supports our Q3 growth targets by allowing us to enter a new market, projected to increase revenue by 15%.
You're showing them the impact, the value it brings to the company.
And finally, let's not forget about email. It's still a major player in the workplace.
Oh yeah, we live in our inboxes.
Clear subject lines are crucial. Instead of project update, try proposal. Cost-saving strategy for Q4, potential 12% reduction in expenses.
Wow, that's specific.
And structure your email clearly. Bullet points, short paragraphs, make it easy to read.
No one wants to wade through a wall of text. So adapting your style to the situation, the audience, that's crucial for success.
Absolutely. Persuasive communication, it's a skill you develop over time. But by using these techniques, you'll see a real difference.
In your confidence, your influence, your career. And speaking of development, the source material gives us some great final action steps.
Yeah, things you can start doing right away. Number 1, practice the PRP method.
In your next meeting, your next presentation, give it a try.
Another one, record yourself speaking. It can be really eye-opening to hear how you sound.
You can identify areas for improvement. And here's another one. Observe other persuasive speakers.
See what they do, how they structure their arguments, the language they use.
Learn from the best. And don't be shy about asking for feedback.
Talk to colleagues, mentors, get their input. It's all about continuous improvement.
So here's a final thought for you to ponder. Think about a recent interaction where you felt you could have been more persuasive.
Yeah, we've all been there.
Now, how could you have applied what we talked about today, the PRP method, the power words, those rhetorical questions?
Could the outcome have been different?
And how could these techniques, used consistently, change your professional path? It's something to think about.
It really is. This ability to express yourself, to be persuasive, it's a game changer in today's global workplace.
Keep practicing, keep refining your approach, and you'll see the results.
You'll be amazed at what you can achieve. Okay, so, we're diving into some listener requests today, and a lot of you have been asking about this whole world of cross-cultural communication. And I think it's especially fascinating, when we're talking about the workplace and those situations where we're all trying to use English, but coming from these really different cultural backgrounds.
Absolutely.
And it seems like, it's not just a nice to have anymore, right?
Yeah.
It's like this essential skill set.
It is. I mean, in today's world, so much of business happens across borders and cultures.
Exactly.
You really can't underestimate how much of an advantage it can be to be able to navigate those sometimes really subtle differences in communication styles.
So, we've got this pile of resources here, and I think our mission today is to really extract the most valuable insights from this stuff. And think about you, the listener, right? What are those actionable tips that you can walk away with today and actually put to use tomorrow to make your interactions, whether it's with colleagues, clients, whoever it might be, just smoother, more effective.
Yeah.
And help avoid those cringeworthy moments.
Right. Those misunderstandings.
Where you're just like, oh, what just happened?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So we're talking about, things like direct versus indirect communication. How much people rely on context. What our body language is saying without us even realizing it.
Yeah.
How different cultures approach meetings.
Right.
Email, all that good stuff.
Yeah.
So maybe let's start with something I think that came up in a lot of these sources, which is this concept of high context versus low context cultures.
Okay.
Can you give us a quick, definition of that? Like, what's the core difference here?
Yeah, so I think the simplest way to put it is, it's about how much meaning is derived from the context surrounding the words themselves versus the actual explicit message.
Yep.
So in high context cultures, a lot of the message is implied through things like the relationships between people, nonverbal cues, the situation itself, and the actual spoken message might be less explicit or less direct.
Okay.
And you tend to find this in cultures with long histories, where communities have been very close-knit. So there's a lot of shared understanding.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That doesn't need to be stated outright.
Like, so for example, like Japan, China.
Yeah, Japan, China, parts of the Middle East definitely fall into that high context category.
And I think you had a really good example in one of the sources about how this indirectness might play out.
Right.
Can you share that?
So let's say you're giving feedback on a project or a proposal.
Okay.
And in a high context culture. Instead of directly saying, this isn't going to work,
right,
or this proposal is unacceptable, you might phrase it as something like, perhaps we could explore other options.
Oh, I see.
So the meaning is kind of there.
Yeah.
It's implied that the current proposal isn't quite right, but you need to pay attention to that nuance to grasp the full message.
Yeah, it's not about being blunt and direct.
Exactly.
It's about hinting at it.
It's about preserving harmony.
Yeah.
Sometimes about saving face.
Okay. And I think, on the other end of that spectrum, you have the low context cultures and what's going on over there.
Right. So in low context cultures, like you find in the US or Germany or Scandinavia, the emphasis is really on clarity.
Okay.
And direct language. The message is very self-contained and explicit. It's, you say what you mean.
Okay.
And there's less reliance on that unspoken understanding.
So it's not about reading between the lines.
Exactly.
It's about what's actually there in the words.
Yeah.
So that same feedback on the proposal would sound really different, I imagine.
It would, yeah. You'd be much more likely to hear something like, this proposal doesn't meet our requirements.
Okay.
Let's revise it to address these specific issues.
So very to the point.
Yeah, very direct.
No ambiguity.
Right.
Okay, so for our listeners out there, this is where it gets really interesting, I think.
Yeah. How do you actually navigate this low context divide in the workplace? I think the most important thing is to be aware of your own style.
Okay.
And then try to adapt to the style of the people you're working with.
Okay.
So if you come from a high context background and you're working with people from low context cultures, it can be really helpful to practice being a bit more direct.
Okay.
Even though it might feel a little uncomfortable at first, your colleagues will likely appreciate the clarity.
Right.
And then on the other side, if you're from a low context culture, working with high context individuals, you're going to want to pay more attention to the nonverbal cues, the tone. Really try to read between the lines a little bit.
So it's like almost like you're flexing a different communication muscle.
Yeah, exactly. It's a skill you can develop.
And building on this whole idea of directness, the sources also talked about this concept of direct versus indirect communication styles more broadly. How's that different from the high context, low context thing?
So while they are definitely related, the indirect communication style focuses more specifically on this preference for just explicit honesty and clarity versus a more nuanced approach where you might be softening criticism or trying to preserve harmony. Okay. So you can have cultures that are high context, but also tend to be more indirect. Okay. But it's not always a perfect overlap. It's really about the delivery of the message itself.
Okay, so it's like that extra layer of nuance in how you're actually conveying the message. Yeah. So how does this play out? You think about like everyday workplace interactions.
Sure. So let's say you're giving feedback on a report.
Okay.
Someone with a very direct style. perhaps from the US, Germany, Netherlands might say something like, your report has several errors. Please correct them by tomorrow morning.
Very to the point.
Yeah, very straight to the point.
Okay, now what would the indirect version of that sound like?
Someone with a more indirect style, maybe from a culture like Japan, India, or Brazil, might say something like, your report is generally very good and we appreciate the effort.
Okay.
Perhaps we could take another look at a few sections to ensure that everything is as polished as possible.
Oh, so it's like
Yeah.
the criticism is still there.
It's there, but it's softened. It's framed as a suggestion for improvement.
And I remember in one of these sources, there was a scenario about an American manager
Yes.
and an Indian employee that really illustrated how this can go wrong.
Yeah, that was a great example. The American manager said, this isn't good enough.
Right.
And you can imagine how that would land for an Indian employee
Yeah.
who's used to a more indirect communication style.
Could be really demoralizing.
Exactly.
And they even gave like an alternative phrasing, something like, you've done well with this and let's refine it further.
Right, much more encouraging.
Yeah.
It's much more constructive.
And so when it comes to giving feedback,
Yeah,
specifically,
yeah.
any advice on how to handle that across cultures?
I think it's so important to really consider that person's background and what their communication style might be. And for people from those more indirect cultures, a technique like the sandwich method can be really helpful.
What's the sandwich method?
So you start with some positive feedback.
Okay.
Then you deliver the constructive criticism.
Okay.
And then you end on a positive note again.
So it's like praise.
Yeah.
Criticism.
Exactly.
Okay, interesting. All right, let's move on to another biggie, which is the whole world of formality and hierarchy.
Yeah, this is a big one.
And I think this applies not just, across countries, but even within organizations.
Absolutely, yeah.
You have different company cultures
Right.
that are more or less formal.
Right.
So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so in more hierarchical cultures, there's a big emphasis on respecting titles, seniority, the established order. Communication tends to be more formal. Junior employees might be less likely to openly challenge their superiors. And, places like South Korea, France, parts of the Middle East would fall into this category.
So it's almost like there's an unspoken set of rules.
There often is, yeah, about how you address people, how you interact.
Okay, now what about those more egalitarian cultures?
So in egalitarian cultures, like you find in Sweden, Australia, Canada, it's much more informal. It's common to use first names.
Even for like the CEO?
Even for the CEO, yeah.
Wow.
And open discussion and debate are generally encouraged.
Regardless of your position?
Regardless of your position.
Oh, okay.
So the emphasis is on that open communication.
I think the example in one of the sources was like a French intern addressing the CEO as Monsieur Dupont.
Right.
Versus a Canadian intern saying, hi, John.
Yeah. Very different.
So if our listeners are trying to, figure out how to handle these different levels of formality, what's the best advice?
I think the most important thing is to pay attention to how your colleagues are interacting with each other and then follow their lead. And when in doubt, especially in those more hierarchical cultures, err on the side of formality. Use titles until you're explicitly invited to do otherwise.
So it's better to be
more formal.
I think so, yeah. It shows respect.
Yeah.
Avoids potential offense.
Okay. All right. Let's talk about nonverbal communication.
Oh, this is a fun one.
Because this is where it gets really tricky,
I
right?
get that.
You can unintentionally send the wrong message.
So easily.
With your body language.
Yeah.
Your gestures. And I think the examples in the sources were just fascinating. Like the
Yeah.
thumbs up gesture, you would think. Universally positive, right?
You'd think so. In the US and much of Europe, it means everything's okay, approval.
Yeah.
But in some parts of the Middle East and even Latin America, it's considered offensive.
Really?
Yeah. Like the equivalent of giving someone the middle finger.
Wow. That's a very huge difference.
Big difference, yeah.
And even nodding your head, you would think. Universal sign for yes. Right. In most cultures it does.
Yeah.
But in Bulgaria, for example, nodding actually means no.
Wow.
Yeah.
So the opposite.
Yeah.
And shaking your head means yes.
Right. Imagine the confusion.
Oh my gosh, yeah. And what about handshakes?
Handshakes are interesting because they're common in a lot of cultures, But the way you execute a handshake can vary. Like in the US, you want that firm handshake sign of confidence. But in many Asian cultures, a softer handshake is the norm.
Okay.
And a firm grip could be perceived as aggressive.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
So you really can't make assumptions.
You can't just assume that your nonverbal cues are going to be interpreted the way you intend them.
So the advice here is...
do your research.
Yeah.
Even a little bit of reading up on common gestures and nonverbal cues can really go a long way.
in the cultures that you're interacting with.
Absolutely.
And it's not just about the gestures, right? Like eye contact and personal space.
Yeah, those are big ones too.
Those are huge.
Yeah, so eye contact, for example,
Yeah.
in Western cultures, it's seen as a sign of attentiveness, honesty, confidence.
Yeah.
But in many Asian and Middle Eastern cultures, direct eye contact, especially with someone in authority, can be seen as disrespectful.
Really?
Yeah, or challenging. So lowering your gaze might actually be a sign of respect.
Oh, that's so interesting. And then personal space, that's another one where, people have really different comfort levels.
Yeah, so in individualistic cultures, people tend to prefer more distance.
Okay.
They value their personal space.
Like in Northern Europe?
Yeah, Northern Europe, and then in more collectivist cultures, like Latin America, closer proximity is more common and comfortable.
I think there was an example of a Swedish employee kind of subtly stepping back when a Brazilian colleague got a little too close for comfort.
Yeah, classic example.
So how do you navigate that?
Be mindful. Pay attention to how your colleagues are interacting with each other and try to mirror their comfort levels.
Okay.
If someone's creating distance, you might be standing too close.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about these kind of fundamental differences, but how do they actually play out in common workplace scenarios?
Right.
So let's take meetings, for example.
Meetings are a great example because there are so many cultural variations in how meetings are run and how decisions are made.
So let's say you're in a culture like the US or Germany.
Okay.
What's the typical meeting style there?
Often it's quite a bit of open debate.
Okay.
People expressing their opinions freely. Decisions are made relatively quickly. There's a focus on efficiency, individual accountability.
Yeah, that's definitely a style that a lot of us are familiar with.
Right.
Now contrast that with what you might see in Japan or China.
So in Japan and China, it's much more about building consensus.
Okay.
Decisions might take longer.
Right.
Everyone's perspective needs to be considered carefully.
Yeah.
You might observe more silence during the meetings. A lot of discussion happens behind the scenes. Outside of the formal meeting, direct confrontation is generally avoided.
Oh, so it's a much more subtle, nuanced approach. So if you're someone who's used to those fast-paced, very direct meetings, you might need to shift gears.
You might.
When you're working with colleagues from these more consensus-driven cultures.
I think the key is to be prepared, to allow more time for discussion, for reflection. Don't expect an immediate decision.
Okay.
It might be a longer process.
And what about email and written communication?
Email is interesting because even when everyone's writing in English, you can still see these cultural preferences.
Yeah. How so?
So in those more direct cultures, like the US, the UK, emails tend to be very concise, to the point, action-oriented. The language is often informal.
Yeah, just get to the point.
Get to the point. What needs to happen?
Exactly.
Now contrast that with how someone from the Middle East or Asia might approach an email.
Right, so you might see more formal greetings, expressions of well-being, a more indirect way of getting to the main purpose.
Yeah.
It's about building rapport.
I think you had some great examples of this. I did, yeah. Like a very American email might be, "Hi, Mark, send the report by EOD."
Right.
And then a more, let's say Japanese email might be, "Dear Mr. Smith, I hope this email finds you well. Would it be possible for you to kindly share the report by the end of the day?"
Exactly.
Very different.
Yeah, much more formal, much more polite.
So the advice there for email is what?
Mirror the tone and the formality of the recipient.
Okay.
So if you're emailing someone who tends to be more formal in their writing, adopt a more formal tone. And vice versa.
All right, so we've covered so much, and I want to make sure that our listeners are walking away with some really concrete, actionable advice.
Yeah.
So can you summarize some of those key takeaways?
Absolutely. I think the first one is just do your research.
Okay.
Even a basic understanding of some of those key cultural norms can make a big difference.
Okay.
Be prepared to adapt your communication style, whether that means being more direct or more indirect, more formal, more informal.
Yeah.
Depending on the situation.
Don't hesitate to ask clarifying questions.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah. If you're unsure about something, just a simple question like, could you help me understand your perspective?
Yeah.
Can prevent a lot of misunderstandings.
Okay.
Observe your colleagues.
Yeah.
See how they're interacting, both that they're saying, how they're saying it, their nonverbal cues, and then try to mirror that. And finally, be patient.
Yeah.
Cross-cultural communication is a journey. Misunderstandings are going to happen. But if you approach them with curiosity, with a willingness to learn, they can be great opportunities to grow.
I love that. Research, adapt, ask, observe, be patient. And that's a really solid foundation.
I think so.
For building those strong professional relationships, in our increasingly global workplaces.
Absolutely.
And I think it really highlights the fact that communication is so much more. Just speaking the same language.
It's about understanding those unspoken cultural frameworks that shape how we interpret messages and how we choose to deliver our own meaning.
Well, this has been such a fascinating deep dive.
It has.
So much great information. You've really helped us unpack this complex topic. And as a final thought for our listeners today, I'm reminded of this great quote by George Bernard Shaw.
Oh, yeah.
He said, the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. And I think in today's world, that's even more true when you have all these cultural differences at play.
Absolutely.
So it really underscores the need for this awareness, this flexibility, this empathy that we've been talking about throughout this entire episode.
It's an ongoing process.
It really is. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure.
This has been fantastic.
It has. It's a really fascinating area and so critically important these days.
It is. So we appreciate you being here.
My pleasure.
So, we were talking about persuasive speaking the other day and how crucial it is in meetings, right? I mean, how many times have you seen a brilliant idea fall flat because it just wasn't presented effectively?
Oh, countless times.
Yeah, right? And it doesn't matter if it's just a quick team check-in or a big formal presentation. Being able to get people on board with your way of thinking, that's like a secret weapon in any job.
It's interesting. You sent me that guide for English learners on this whole topic of persuasive speaking in meetings, and I gotta say, I was surprised by how much practical stuff was in there. So I thought it'd be great to kind of do a deep dive today, break it down, and pull out the really valuable strategies, the stuff that our listeners can actually use to be more, influential and effective next time they're in a meeting.
Absolutely. And what's really cool is that while it is technically for English language learners, the core ideas are like universal. It's about the fundamentals of how we humans are persuaded. So think of this as a cheat sheet, right? To understanding how to make your voice not just heard, but how to make it resonate and actually lead to, real action.
That's a great way to put it. And the guide kind of starts by setting the stage, right? And one of the first things it emphasizes is that persuasion, real persuasion, is about ethical influence, not about tricking or manipulating people.
Right.
And then it talks about these three big pillars: ethos, pathos, and logos. And I think for a lot of people, those words might sound a bit abstract. So for someone who's, prepping for a meeting, what do these actually look like in practice?
Yeah, that's the key, right? How do you take this theory and make it work for you? So ethos, that's your credibility. And it's not just about your job title. It's about things like being prepared, showing up, having done your homework, being able to articulate your points really clearly and concisely, especially right from the get-go. It shows you respect everyone's time. Pathos is about tapping into your audience's emotions and concerns. What keeps them up at night? What are they struggling with? So instead of just throwing data at them, frame it in a way that shows how it's going to impact their goals, or solve their specific problems. And logos, that's the logic, right? It's about having the evidence to back up your claims. You need data, case studies, whatever it takes to show that you're not just talking off the top of your head.
I think that's so important because you can have the most logical argument in the world, but if people don't trust you or they don't connect with the why behind it, you're not going to get very far. And speaking of being prepared, the guide really pushes you to think deeply about your audience before you even start putting together what you're going to say.
Oh, absolutely. You need to know who you're talking to. So who are the actual decision makers in the room? What are their KPIs? What are they being measured on? Because understanding their motivations and what might trip them up, it's like having a roadmap before you even start driving, right? Mm-hmm. And thinking about those potential objections, it's not about being negative, it's about being strategic so you're ready for them.
Exactly. It's like, anticipating those speed bumps so you can navigate around them. And the guide then brings up this AIDA model. Attention, interest, desire, action. That's pretty classic, but how do you make sure it doesn't sound too, canned or formulaic in a real live meeting?
Yeah, so the beauty of AIDA is that it's flexible. So grabbing attention, it doesn't have to be some huge dramatic statement. It could be something like a surprising statistic or a question that gets people thinking about a challenge you all face.
Right. Then you build interest by directly connecting your proposal to their needs. So instead of just saying, hey, we need a new system, you might say, this new system will save your team hours each week on reporting. See, that's connecting it to their pain point. Desire comes from painting a picture of what's possible, the benefits, right? So maybe it's increased efficiency, cost savings, better outcomes, whatever it is for them. And then the action needs to be crystal clear and easy to follow. So instead of leaving it vague, you say, okay, let's schedule a follow-up for next week to hammer out the details. It's like a framework, not a script, right?
Yeah.
It's about guiding the conversation.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And underpinning all of this, you can have the best framework in the world, but you have to have evidence to support it. The guide mentions things like data, case studies, expert opinions, what makes evidence truly compelling in a meeting. It has to be specific and relatable. So instead of just saying our customer satisfaction is up, you say our net promoter score jumped 15% last quarter. Bam! That's a number people understand. Case studies, they work best when they're like a mirror, reflecting your audience's own industry or situation. So you could say, hey, remember company X? They had a similar problem and they saw a 20% efficiency boost after implementing this type of solution. And then expert opinions can add that extra weight, but make sure it's someone your audience actually respects, right? Someone they'll recognize as credible.
Okay, so we've got the foundation laid, the groundwork. Now let's talk about some tactics. The guide dives into specific persuasive techniques, and the first one is storytelling.
Yeah.
Now, I get how stories can be engaging, but how do you work them into a business setting without it feeling, like you're reading a bedtime story?
You got to keep them short and sweet and to the point. Think of anecdotes as little illustrations, right? They make your points more memorable. So instead of just saying, our marketing campaign was a success, you could share a quick story about a customer whose problem was solved by the campaign and what impact that had. The guide also mentions using a competitor's success story, and that can be really clever because it shows what's possible and it can spark a little, healthy competition.
It makes it real, right? Like, oh, if they can do it, we can too. Then there's the idea of rhetorical questions. How do you use those effectively without sounding like you're, putting words in people's mouths?
Rhetorical questions are about getting people to think. The guide gives this example. What if we could increase customer retention by 30% with just one strategy? See, you're not asking for an answer right there. You're prompting people to consider the possibilities. And the key is to make sure that question is relevant to their needs. Something that will actually make them go, that's interesting.
And the guide also talks about repetition, like using the rule of 3. It sounds so simple, but why is saying something 3 times so powerful?
It's about pattern recognition. Our brains love patterns, and 3 seems to be the magic number. It's memorable, but it's not overkill, right? It creates a sense of completion and rhythm. The example they give, quality, efficiency, innovation, it's like a drumbeat. By repeating those core values, you're making them stick.
It's like a mantra almost, right? And then there's this contrast principle, which sounds intriguing. How can you use that to your advantage in a meeting?
The contrast principle is all about making your proposal shine by putting it next to something less appealing. The guide uses the example of comparing an old clunky system with a new streamlined approach. By clearly laying out the problems with the old way and then showing how the new way is faster, cheaper, whatever the benefits are, you make the choice seem obvious. But you got to be careful not to oversimplify things, or create these false either-or situations, because the world is usually more complex than that.
Yeah, nuance is important. Okay, so when you're trying to appeal to logic and data, how do you make sure those arguments really hit home?
It's not just about the numbers themselves, it's about the story behind them. So instead of just saying revenue went up, you say, we saw a 25% revenue increase in 6 months. Boom, that's concrete, it shows results. And the guide also suggests visuals, which is so smart. I mean, a good chart or graph, it can communicate complex information way better than a bunch of text. It makes it easier to digest, and it leaves a bigger impact.
Visuals are so powerful. Okay, last tactic, creating urgency. It's a classic sales move. But how do you do it ethically, especially in a professional context?
Urgency has to be genuine, not some made-up pressure tactic. So the guide uses the example of, like, competitors gaining ground. That's a real business concern. You have to explain clearly what might happen if you don't act or what you stand to gain if you do. But you got to balance it with logic. You don't want to create this artificial panic.
Right, it's about urgency, not a fire alarm. Okay, so you've made your case, you've presented your argument, and then boom, someone throws out an objection. The guide has a whole section on handling objections gracefully, which seems so crucial for keeping things moving.
Oh yeah, objections are part of the game. And the guide stresses that you shouldn't see them as roadblocks, but as chances to explain things better or dive deeper into the issue. The most important thing is to acknowledge the concern. So if someone says, hey, this is way too expensive, you say, I hear you on the budget concerns, right?
Right.
It shows you're listening and you take their point seriously. And then you need to have a response ready, whether it's data, logic, whatever, to address that concern head on. The example they give about budget constraints versus long-term savings, that's a great way to reframe the issue.
It's like turning a negative into a positive. And then there's this feel, felt, found technique, which sounds like a really empathetic way to deal with skepticism. Can you break that down for us?
Yeah, it's a three-step process. First, you acknowledge the person's feeling, right? So you might say, I understand why you might feel hesitant about this big investment right now. Then you bring in a relatable experience, like other teams felt the same way initially, and then you hit them with the positive outcome. But what they found was that the efficiency gains led to significant cost savings in the long run. It's like you're validating their concerns while gently nudging them towards a different viewpoint.
That's very subtle, right? It's not confrontational. And I love the idea of turning objections into opportunities.
Yeah.
How do you take a concern and use it to actually make your argument stronger?
When someone raises an objection, it often means there's something they're not getting right, or there's a worry that hasn't been fully addressed. So the guide's example about a project being too expensive and then reframing it as a return on investment, that's a perfect example. You're shifting the focus from the upfront cost to the long-term value. It requires you to really understand the underlying issue and then come back with more information or a different angle that addresses it.
So we've covered all these strategies, but how do you actually get good at this stuff? The guide wraps up with a section on putting it all into practice. What are the key takeaways there?
Persuasion, it's a skill. Like any skill, it takes practice. So the guide suggests role-playing common business situations, which I think is brilliant. It lets you try out different approaches and responses in a low-pressure setting. So imagine practicing how you'd pitch a new project to your team or negotiate a contract. You know, it's like a dress rehearsal.
It takes the pressure off, right? And then there's this idea of recording yourself speaking. Now, that might sound a little scary to some people, but I can see how it could be really helpful.
It can be a little cringy, I admit. But watching yourself back, it's like getting this unbiased feedback. You can see how clear you're being, your tone, your pace, how effectively you're using those persuasive techniques. It helps you pinpoint areas you might not even realize you need to work on.
It's like having another set of eyes on yourself.
Yeah.
And of course, it's not just about the words, right? Your body language, your tone of voice, all that plays a huge role.
Huge. Nonverbal communication can totally make or break your message. Eye contact, it builds trust, it shows you're confident. Using gestures, it can emphasize your points. Varying your tone, it keeps people engaged. And it signals what's important. It's all about presenting yourself in a way that backs up your message, you know?
So to sum it all up, becoming a more persuasive speaker in meetings, it's about understanding how persuasion works, being prepared, having a toolbox of techniques ready to go, and knowing how to handle those curveballs when they come your way.
Exactly. And it's a journey, you know? It's about constantly learning and getting better. By putting these principles into practice and thinking about what works and what doesn't, you can really level up your ability to influence people and get things done in meetings.
And for our listeners, the challenge is to take this information and figure out how to use it in your own work lives. So before your next big meeting, take a few minutes to really think about who you're talking to. Maybe structure your argument using the AIDA model and pick a couple of persuasive techniques you want to try out. And be ready to listen to those objections, and see them as chances to make your case even stronger. And most importantly, remember that practice makes progress.
And that brings up a final thought. Think about a recent meeting where you wish you'd been more persuasive. Looking back now, what might you have done differently? And as you get ready for your next meeting, pick one specific technique you're going to use consciously and see how it goes. Persuasive speaking isn't about manipulation. It's about effectively communicating the value of your ideas and bringing people along with you.
I think that's a great point to end on. Thanks for sharing your insights today.
My pleasure.
And to all our listeners out there, best of luck with your next meeting.
You got this. All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something that can feel pretty tricky, honestly, especially if English isn't your native language. We're talking about networking, you know, at those professional events, those conferences, all that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, for anyone, it can be kind of nerve-wracking. But yeah, if you're thinking, okay, I got to go to this corporate summit, or there's that industry conference coming up, or even just like a local startup thing, you know, a pitch session or a meetup. I mean, how you connect with people there, it really matters. And for you listening, well, we want to make that whole thing way easier.
Exactly. Like, we want you to feel like you can walk into those things and actually, you know, start conversations that go somewhere, build actual relationships that last, not just like survive the event, you know?
Yeah, totally. I mean, even for people who are like advanced English learners.
Yeah.
You know, you've got great language skills, but it's those little things.
Yeah.
Like conversations, they're so spontaneous, right? And then there's all that unspoken professional etiquette stuff. It can make it feel like, whoa, the stakes are high here.
Right. Like, what do I do with my hands? Where do I stand?
Exactly. So that's what we're doing today. We're going to be your guide, your personal guide, and we're going to give you really practical strategies, not just to survive, like we said, but to actually do really well in these situations, to walk out of there feeling like, yeah, I got this.
I am the master networker.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. So over the next few minutes, we're breaking it all down. How to walk in feeling confident, how to start those conversations that lead somewhere, and how to build those relationships that actually last.
Perfect.
Okay. Let's get into it. First things first, and this is even before you pick out what you're going to wear, it's preparation.
Oh yeah, preparation is huge. It's everything.
I mean, it might sound obvious, but how you get ready beforehand, it can make a world of difference.
So true. Showing up and just hoping for the best, that's not going to cut it. You got to be strategic about it.
Yeah.
And step one, right off the bat, research that event.
Yeah, do your homework.
What's it all about? Is it about the newest innovations? Is it about companies making deals with each other? Is it even like for recruiting? Figuring out that main purpose, it shapes how you approach the whole thing, you know? And it helps you decide what your goal should be.
Right, and knowing the purpose, well, that helps you figure out who's probably going to be there, right?
Exactly.
Like, are we talking about the big names in your industry, potential clients you've been wanting to connect with, maybe even hiring managers if you're, you know, looking at new job options? Knowing that ahead of time, it lets you tailor your approach. Like, say you know a big industry leader is going to be presenting. You might want to just...
Yeah, do a little digging into their work, you know, see what their company's been up to, maybe read some of their recent stuff. It's not just about being prepared. It gives you a natural way to start talking to them. Like, imagine you're a software developer going to this tech conference, right? And you find out the CTO of some huge AI company is doing a keynote. Well, spend a little time, read their stuff on LinkedIn, check out their company's press releases, all that. It's not just good prep, it's like your ticket into a cool conversation with them. You can be like, hey, I read your article on blah, 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 and they'll see you're genuinely interested.
Right, it shows you're not just there for the free snacks.
Exactly. For you, it shows you're serious.
Yeah, that's a good point. So that actually leads us nicely into preparing discussion topics, and we're not talking about like a script you memorize, you know, word for word, but having some relevant things to talk about based on, you know, trends in your field, big changes happening, even some recent company news. It shows the people you meet that you're engaged, you know what's going on, and you're ready to actually talk.
Right. Like, what are the hot topics everyone's talking about in your industry? What are those big debates, those discussions going on? What new technologies are coming out and everyone's buzzing about? Having a few of those in your back pocket, it makes starting those conversations way easier.
It's like having your talking points ready.
Yeah, exactly. And another important thing, go into the event knowing what you want to get out of it. You know, what are your goals? Are you actively looking for a new job? Maybe you want to find companies to partner with, or are you mainly there to learn about the latest trends?
Having those specific goals, it's like your compass, right? It guides you the whole time you're there.
Totally.
Now, a really important part of getting ready and this is big, is crafting your elevator pitch.
Ah, yes, the elevator pitch.
So for those who might not know, this is basically your short and sweet answer to that classic question, so what do you do?
Yeah.
You're going to hear that a lot.
And it's amazing, you should really pay attention to this, how often that simple question, it throws people off. Your elevator pitch, it's got to be quick, ideally under 30 seconds, but it's got to make an impact, leave a good impression. It's like your professional snapshot,
Yeah.
It says who you are, what you do, and this is key for connecting, what makes you valuable, what you bring to the table.
Right. And to make this super clear, let's look at an example. Say Maria, she's a UX designer, right? She meets someone new. She might say, hello, I'm Maria. I'm a UX designer, and I specialize in making really intuitive digital experiences for e-commerce brands. My last project, I helped a startup boost their sales conversions by 30%. I'm here to learn about the latest trends in UX design and to connect with other people in the field. See how much she fit in there.
She nailed it. She really did. For you, the key things to notice there are that she clearly says what she does, her specific area, a real achievement that shows her impact, that 30% boost, and what she's hoping to get from the event. She doesn't just say her job title, she shows the actual results she gets. And, importantly, she ends by saying she wants to connect with people, which, like we said, that's the whole point of networking.
So let's give you some actionable tips to make your own awesome elevator pitch. First, keep it short, like we said, under 30 seconds. Really highlight what makes you stand out, your special skills, your relevant experience, your big wins, all that. And this is important. Don't make it a one-size-fits-all.
Yeah.
You gotta adapt it a little depending on who you're talking to. Like if you're talking to a potential investor, you might emphasize different things than if you're chatting with a colleague, right?
Yeah, being flexible is key. And of course, practice makes perfect. You want your pitch to sound natural, confident, not like you're reading it off a cue card. Say it out loud, record yourself, practice in front of a mirror, whatever works, until it feels smooth and natural.
Right, not robotic.
Exactly.
And speaking of not sounding like a robot, let's talk about some common mistakes to avoid. Nerves can get to us all, and sometimes that makes us talk super fast, which can make it hard for others to understand, especially if English isn't their first language either. So pace yourself.
Yeah, take a breath. And I think we've all been there where we want to tell them everything we do, all our accomplishments, right? We overload them with info.
Yeah.
But remember, the goal with that initial elevator pitch is to spark their interest, get the conversation going, not to recite your entire resume. Keep it focused and concise. That's how you make a good impression.
Like you want to leave them wanting more.
Exactly.
And finally, watch out for using too much jargon. It's fine to use industry terms when you're talking to people in your field, they'll get it. But if you're talking to people from different backgrounds or people who are still learning English, avoid those super complex words, those niche terms that might confuse them. Clarity is key, always. So you've done your research, your pitch is polished. Now comes the moment of truth. Actually walking into that networking space. And let's be real, even for pros, that can bring on the nerves.
Oh, absolutely. It's totally normal to feel a little nervous. Even people who network all the time, they might feel some anxiety before diving into a crowded room. The trick is having ways to manage that nervousness. Positive self-talk can really help. Remind yourself of what you're good at, your experience, what you bring to the table. Remember, everyone else there, they're there for the same reason, to connect.
Right. And another tip, think about getting to the event a bit early. Might seem counterintuitive, but being one of the first people there, it can actually help you relax, get comfortable. It's calmer before the rush, right? It gives you a chance to get the lay of the land and maybe even strike up a few conversations while it's still chill. It's a good confidence booster before things get crazy.
Right. So true. And don't underestimate body language. It's powerful for first impressions. Walk in, stand tall, keep an open posture, arms uncrossed, shoulders back, make eye contact, smile genuinely. Those nonverbal cues, they say, hey, I'm confident, I'm approachable. It makes people more likely to start a conversation with you. For you, that can make a huge difference in how people see you.
Like imagine you're at this business seminar, right? Instead of hovering by the snacks looking lost, you walk up to a smaller group that's already talking. You smile confidently, open posture, and it shows them you're open to joining in. Makes it way easier for them to welcome you in.
Exactly. Now, the big question is, how do you actually approach a group or someone you want to talk to? If you're going for a group, take a second, observe them. Are they in deep discussion, or is there a pause? Look for a natural opening where you can politely jump in without interrupting. Maybe you overhear something that relates directly to your field or something from the event.
That's your cue. Like, a simple approach could be, "Excuse me, I couldn't help but overhear your conversation about digital marketing trends. That's something I'm really interested in. Do you mind if I join in?" Boom, you're in the conversation, and you've shown genuine interest in what they're talking about.
Perfect. And if you're approaching an individual, being direct but friendly works best. You could try, "Hi, I'm your name. I notice you're from company name. I've heard good things about your recent product launch." It shows you've done a little homework, even if it's just from the event materials. And it gives you a specific thing to connect on beyond just, "Hi, how are you?"
Right. And a friendly handshake, a genuine smile, those go a long way. It's all about showing you're open to connecting, to building those relationships. So you've started a conversation, great. Now how do you keep it going? How do you make it actually meaningful? This is where the art of small talk comes in.
Now, small talk sometimes gets a bad rap, but for you, in a networking situation, it's essential. It's like the oil that keeps things running smoothly. It breaks the ice. You build that initial connection before you get into the serious stuff. It's like building a little bridge to those more important topics.
I like that, the bridge analogy.
Yeah.
And there are some go-to topics you can always use for small talk at these events. The event itself is always a safe bet. You can ask, "What do you think of the keynote this morning?" Or, "Have you been to this conference before?" Easy starters. Everyone has an opinion.
And industry trends are another good one. You could ask, "How do you think all this AI stuff is going to change content creation in the next few years?" Or, "What are some of the biggest challenges your company's facing with all these changes happening?" These questions show you're engaged with the bigger picture, thinking about the industry as a whole.
Right, you're not just thinking about your own little bubble.
Exactly.
And don't forget about personal interests, but keep it professional, of course. Like, asking someone what got you into this field in the first place can lead to some really interesting conversations. It can help you find common ground beyond just your current jobs.
Totally. And what's really cool, and you should pay attention to this, is how you smoothly transition from that initial small talk to deeper, more meaningful conversations. The key is to really listen to what the other person is saying and look for those opportunities to dive deeper into stuff you're both interested in. Ask open-ended questions, the kind they can't just answer yes or no to. Questions make them think and share their experiences.
So instead of asking, "Are you enjoying the conference?" which they might just say, "Yeah, it's all right," try something like, "What have been some of the most insightful sessions you've attended, and what made them so valuable for you?" That gets them talking.
Right, and if they mention a challenge their industry is facing, a good follow-up for you could be, "What do you think are some potential solutions to that?" Or, "What strategies are people using to address that?" Or if they talk about a project they're excited about, ask them to tell you more about what makes it so engaging, what they enjoy about it. These kinds of questions show genuine interest and make the conversation go deeper.
To make this real for you, imagine you meet a digital marketer at an event. You start with some casual small talk about the event itself, maybe a speaker you both liked. Then you naturally move into talking about trends in social media advertising. From there, you ask how they're seeing brands use storytelling to really engage their audience. Now you're having a real conversation, sharing insights, learning from each other's experiences.
Exactly. The goal is to move past those surface-level chit-chat and really get into shared interests, common challenges, those potential ways you could work together. That's where the good stuff happens, the real connections.
And once you've had that good conversation, it's so important to exchange contact info so you can stay connected.
Absolutely. You've made a good connection. Now you got to keep that momentum going after the event. Business cards are still a thing. They're valuable. Make sure yours are up to date and have them ready to go.
Yeah, keep those cards handy.
And these days, connecting on LinkedIn is pretty much essential. A simple, "It was great talking with you. Can I send you a connection request on LinkedIn?" That's a standard, effective way to stay in touch professionally. If you can, personalize the request, mention something specific you talked about. It helps them remember you and why they should connect.
And after the event's over, the follow-up, that's where you really build the relationship. Don't underestimate a quick, thoughtful email to the people you met. A simple message like, "Hi, name. It was great meeting you, and I really enjoyed our conversation about mention the topic. Let's stay in touch." It can go a long way.
And what's really impactful is sending a personalized follow-up. If you remember something they were particularly interested in, or you come across an article or a resource you think they'd like, share it with them. Like, you could send an email saying, "Hi, name. Remember we talked about the latest trends in sustainable tech at the conference. I saw this article and thought of you." It shows you are listening and you're thinking of them even after the event.
And if the conversation was really good and you both think there's potential to work together, don't be shy about suggesting a follow-up meeting. Maybe a virtual coffee chat or an in-person meeting, depending on where you both are and what you talked about. It's a chance to explore those possibilities. Now, let's be honest. Networking can be awkward sometimes. Things happen, especially when you're doing it in English. So let's talk about some of those tricky situations you might run into.
One that happens to all of us, it's totally normal, is forgetting someone's name after you just met them. It's a human thing. The key is to handle it smoothly. Be polite, direct, and just ask for a reminder. You can say, "I'm so sorry, I've completely blanked. Could you remind me of your name?" Most people are totally understanding.
Or if you're feeling brave, use some humor. A little, "Oh dear, names are my weakness, please remind me," can lighten the mood and make it less awkward for both of you.
Yeah, humor can be a lifesaver. Another important skill is knowing how to gracefully exit a conversation when you're ready to move on. You don't want to be stuck talking to one person the whole time and miss out on other connections. Use a polite transition. Something like, "It's been great talking with you. I want to make sure I connect with a few more people before the event ends." That's a professional way to move on.
Or if you see someone nearby that you think the person you're talking to might also want to meet, offer to introduce them. You could say, "It was really interesting talking about topic. Have you met Sarah yet? She's also working on related area. You two might have things in common." It's a natural way to excuse yourself, and you might even help them make a connection.
Exactly. And for those of you who might feel a little shy about your English in these situations, remember, focus on communicating clearly. Don't worry about using fancy words or complicated sentences. If you can't think of the right word, paraphrase, explain it another way. The important thing is getting your ideas across.
Right. Most people at these events, they get it. They just want to understand you. So focus on making yourself understood and keep your confidence up, even if you're feeling unsure about your English. What really matters is your willingness to engage, to connect, to share your experiences.
Absolutely.
All right, let's quickly go over what we've covered. We talked about how important preparation is, from researching the event and figuring out who's going to be there, to really nailing your elevator pitch.
We talked about how to walk into that networking space feeling confident, using positive self-talk to manage those nerves, and using open, approachable body language to make a good first impression.
We went through mastering small talk, giving you some go-to topics, and then explain how to take those initial conversations to a deeper level, asking open-ended questions and really listening. We also talked about the best ways to exchange contact info and how to follow up afterward, emphasizing the importance of personalizing those messages.
And finally, we tackled some of those awkward situations that can come up, giving you tips for dealing with things like forgetting names, gracefully ending conversations, and offering advice for those who might not feel 100% confident in their English.
The big takeaway here is that networking in English, just like any other skill, it takes preparation, confidence, and practice. By using these strategies, you'll be way better equipped to connect with people, build those strong, lasting professional relationships, and open up new opportunities for yourself.
So here's what you can do right now to put all this into practice. First, practice your elevator pitch. Stand in front of the mirror, say it out loud, maybe record yourself, and get comfortable with it. Second, if you can, go to a virtual networking event. It's a lower pressure way to practice and build your confidence from home. Third, at your next in-person event, challenge yourself to start conversations with at least 3 new people. And finally, after each event, think about how it went. What felt good? What were the challenges? What can you improve for next time?
This brings up a really interesting thought. Think about the amazing connections and opportunities that could come from you just stepping a little outside your comfort zone at your next networking event. You never know who you'll meet, what you'll learn, or what doors might open just by putting yourself out there and making that effort to connect.
It's true. You never know what might happen.
And that's the deep dive for today. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for having me. It was fun. Ever get that feeling at work when you need to give someone feedback and you just freeze up?
Yeah.
You're totally searching for the right words.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
Especially if you're trying to navigate all of that in English.
Yeah.
It's a pretty common challenge, I think.
Yeah, big time. I think it's something we can all relate to. And, especially these days when so many of us are working in global teams and, communicating effectively across cultures, it feels even more important to get that feedback right.
Absolutely. And it's not just about avoiding awkwardness, it's about being a good leader and helping people grow.
Exactly. And that's actually what today's deep dive is all about. We've been digging into this really insightful guide for advanced English speakers, all about mastering the art of giving constructive feedback and performance reviews.
Yeah.
In a way that actually helps people improve and doesn't just make things awkward.
It's like a masterclass in communication for the workplace.
Right, like a shortcut to feeling confident and in control during those sometimes tricky conversations.
And the guide is super comprehensive. It covers everything from understanding the psychology of feedback, like why some feedback lands well and some just backfires, to really practical stuff like how to handle common workplace scenarios, how to choose the right phrases, and even how to structure those all-important performance reviews.
Okay, so let's jump right in. One thing that really struck me early on in the guide was the emphasis on why feedback is so essential in the first place. We often think of it as just pointing out errors or areas for improvement, but it's so much more than that, isn't it?
Yeah, it's way more than that. When it's done well, feedback actually becomes this powerful tool for growth, not just for the person receiving the feedback, but for the whole team.
Right, it's like that rising tide lifts all boats kind of thing.
Exactly. The guide makes this point that constructive feedback can help boost individual development, make teams work together more effectively, clarify expectations for everyone, and even significantly improve morale and engagement.
So it's not just about fixing problems, it's about creating a more positive and productive work environment.
Totally. It's about shifting the focus from blame to growth. Wow. So instead of just pointing out what someone did wrong, it's about helping them understand how to do it better. And in turn, that makes the whole team stronger and everyone feels more motivated.
Now, the guide also makes this really important distinction between feedback that's actually helpful and feedback that just isn't. What's that crucial difference?
I think it all boils down to the intention and the approach.
Yeah.
Constructive feedback, the kind that leads to positive change. It always focuses on specific behaviors, not on someone's personality or who they are as a person.
Right, so it's less about saying you are this or that, and more about saying when you did this, the impact was this.
Exactly. And it also goes beyond just identifying the problem. It aims to provide actionable solutions, tangible steps the person can take to improve. And ultimately, the whole purpose of constructive feedback is to support learning and development. It's about helping people grow and become better at what they do.
And they contrast that with what they call destructive feedback, which often involves personal criticisms, vague language, and it doesn't really offer a clear path forward.
Yeah, and it's pretty obvious why that kind of feedback doesn't really work. It just leaves people feeling discouraged and defensive, and it doesn't actually help them improve.
They even give this really stark contrasting example in the guide. I found it so helpful. It's like instead of just saying your report was terrible, which, let's be honest, no one wants to hear.
Right. It's like the ultimate motivation killer.
The constructive alternative they give is the report had some strong points, but the data analysis section could be more detailed. Let's discuss how to improve it. It's such a difference in tone and approach.
It's night and day. The constructive version acknowledges the positive aspects, pinpoints a specific area for development, and most importantly, it invites a collaborative discussion on how to get better.
It feels so much more respectful and encouraging.
For sure. And the guide goes on to walk us through some common workplace scenarios, those tricky situations that we all encounter from time to time.
Yeah, like missed deadlines. I think everyone has been there at some point.
Definitely. And the guide has some really insightful advice on how to handle that gracefully.
So what's the recommended approach?
Well, it starts with acknowledging the person's effort, so you're not just coming in hot with accusations. Then you clearly state the issue in this case, that the deadline was missed. And here's the key. You ask for their perspective. There might be reasons or challenges you're not aware of. And finally, you offer support to help prevent similar situations in the future.
It's like taking a collaborative problem-solving approach rather than just being punitive.
Exactly. It's about understanding the situation and working together to find solutions.
And they provide a specific script for how that conversation might sound right.
Yeah, they do, which is super helpful. It goes something like, I appreciate your hard work on the project. However, I noticed that the last 2 reports were submitted after the deadline. Is there something preventing you from meeting the timeline? Let's see how we can adjust your workload or improve time management.
Okay, so it's direct about the issue, but also empathetic and solution-oriented.
Exactly. It strikes that balance really well.
That feels so much more productive than just expressing frustration or disappointment.
Totally. And sometimes the issue isn't just about timing, it's about the quality of the work itself.
Right, like when someone is just not performing up to expectations. How do we handle that?
So for those situations, the guide introduces this really handy framework called the SBI model.
SBI, what's that stand for?
It stands for Situation Behavior Impact. It's a really simple but powerful way to structure your feedback.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about how it works.
So basically, you break down your feedback into 3 parts. You start by describing the specific situation where the issue occurred. Then you detail the specific behavior you observed. And finally, you explain the impact that behavior had.
Situation, behavior, impact.
Yeah.
Okay, I see how that creates a really clear and objective framework.
And by focusing on those objective facts, the where, the what, and the so, what you take out a lot of the emotional subjectivity, and it makes it easier for the person to hear what you're saying.
It's less about personal judgment and more about the concrete consequences.
Exactly. And the guide even gives some template examples. For the situation, they might say, during last week's client presentation. Then for the behavior, they might say, I noticed that several of the slides had outdated figures. And finally, for the impact, they might say, which made the client question the accuracy of our data.
Okay, so by laying it out in that way, it's super clear what happened and why it matters.
Right. And then they also give a full example of dialogue using this model. It's about someone who seemed disengaged during a team meeting.
Yeah, let's hear that one.
So it goes something like, in the last team meeting, I noticed that you seemed disengaged and didn't contribute to the discussion. This made it harder for the team to brainstorm ideas and move forward. Is everything okay? How can we help you participate more?
Okay, so again, it starts with a specific observation of behavior,
Right.
then explores the impact, and ends with an offer of support.
Exactly. It's a really clear and constructive approach.
Now, sometimes it's not about addressing negative performance. Sometimes you have an employee who's maybe underperforming, but you can see that they have a lot of potential.
Oh yeah, those are the ones that can be tricky. You want to encourage them and help them grow, but you also need to be honest about the areas where they need to improve.
Right, so how do we strike that balance?
The key is to acknowledge their strengths and potential while also being clear about the areas where they need to step it up. It's about setting expectations for future performance, but also reminding them that you believe in their abilities.
And what's the example they give for this kind of encouraging feedback?
So they say something like, you have great potential, and I've seen you handle complex tasks really well. However, I've noticed some errors in recent reports. Let's work on developing a checklist to ensure accuracy moving forward.
Okay, so it starts with a positive affirmation, then addresses the specific issue, and then proposes a tangible solution.
Exactly. It's a really nice blend of support and direction.
Now, shifting gears a little bit, let's talk about something a bit more formal, performance reviews in English.
Yeah.
What are the essential components of a well-structured review, according to the guide?
So they recommend starting with a positive opening. Then you move on to discussing the employee's strengths. After that, you address areas for improvement. Then you set clear goals and action plans. And finally, you close the review with a supportive and forward-looking tone.
So it's all about creating a clear and logical flow.
Yeah, it's like telling a story. You want to start on a positive note, build up to the areas for improvement, and then end with a sense of hope and possibility.
And they give specific examples for each of those stages, right?
They do, which makes it super practical. So for the positive opening, they suggest saying something like, I want to start by acknowledging your contributions this quarter especially, and then you fill in the blank with a specific achievement.
Okay, so you're starting by making the person feel valued and appreciated.
Exactly. And then when you move on to discussing their strengths again, it's all about being specific. So instead of just saying something generic like you're a good team player, you might say one of your biggest strengths is your ability to collaborate effectively. For example, and then you describe a specific instance where they demonstrated that skill.
Okay, so you're giving concrete evidence to support your praise.
Right. And then when it comes to addressing areas for improvement, the guide talks about using softening language.
Softening language. What does that mean exactly?
It's about framing constructive criticism in a less direct and confrontational way. So instead of just bluntly pointing out a weakness, you use phrases that present the feedback as suggestions for development.
So what are some examples of softening language?
The guide suggests phrases like, one area to perhaps focus on could be, or have you considered trying, or what are your thoughts on? This kind of language makes it feel more like a collaborative discussion and less like a judgment.
Right, it takes the sting out of the criticism.
Yeah, exactly. And then once you've identified those areas for development, the next key step is to set clear goals and develop action plans. So you might say something like, over the next quarter, let's aim to grip, and then you state a specific achievable goal. Would any additional training or resources be helpful in achieving this?
Okay, so you're making it very clear what the expectations are and how the person can meet them.
Right. It's about providing that roadmap for improvement.
And finally, you end the review on a positive and supportive note.
Yeah, the guide suggests saying something like, I'm confident that by working together, we can make progress in these areas. Let's schedule a follow-up meeting next month to track our progress and discuss any challenges you might be facing.
So you're reinforcing your commitment to their development and establishing accountability.
Exactly. It's a really nice way to wrap things up.
This whole structure for performance reviews feels so thoughtful and well organized.
And beyond the overall structure, the guide also offers some really practical tips for giving feedback effectively in English in general.
Yeah, let's dive into those. What's the first tip?
The first one is all about the power of I statements.
I statements. Why are those so important?
So I statements are a really effective way to deliver feedback in a way that minimizes defensiveness. When you use I statements, you're shifting the focus from blaming the other person to expressing your own observations and perspectives.
So it's less accusatory and more about sharing your own experience.
Exactly. The guide gives this clear contrast instead of saying you didn't follow instructions, which sounds very blaming and judgmental.
What's the I statement version?
You could say, I noticed that some steps were missed in the process. That subtle shift in language makes a big difference.
Yeah, it feels so much less personal and attacking.
Right. And the next tip is all about being specific, not vague.
We touched on this earlier, but why is specificity so important in feedback?
Well, think about it. If someone tells you you need to improve your communication skills, what does that even mean?
Right, it's so broad and unhelpful.
Exactly. It doesn't give you any clue what you need to change or how to do it. But if someone gives you specific feedback, like when responding to client emails, try to acknowledge their specific concerns before offering solutions, that's something you can actually work with.
So it's about giving people clear and actionable advice.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the third tip is to offer solutions, not just criticism.
Which really aligns with the whole idea of constructive feedback being about growth and improvement.
Totally. It's not enough to just point out the problem. You need to provide guidance on how to fix it.
Right. So what's a good way to do that?
The guide suggests using a template, like instead of, and then you describe the current behavior perhaps you could try, and then you offer a specific suggestion for improvement.
Okay. So you're giving them a tangible next step.
Right. And the fourth tip is to encourage a two-way conversation. Meaning that feedback shouldn't be a one-way lecture. It should be a dialogue. You want to invite the other person's perspective and input. You know, ask questions like, how do you feel about this feedback? Or do you have any suggestions on how we can move forward?
Right. It's about creating that sense of partnership in the improvement process.
Exactly. And the final tip is the importance of following up.
So it's not just a one-time conversation. You need to circle back and make sure things are moving in the right direction.
Absolutely. Following up demonstrates that you're committed to the person's development, and it gives you a chance to address any questions or challenges they might be having.
This whole guide is like a treasure trove of communication wisdom. It really gives you a solid foundation for giving feedback effectively in English.
It really does.
So just to recap some of the key takeaways. Remember the importance of clarity, empathy, and professionalism. Focus on specific behaviors, offer solutions, and foster open communication through dialogue and follow-up.
And you know, if we zoom out a little bit, mastering these communication skills is so valuable for anyone in a leadership role, especially in today's globalized workplace.
Right, it's about building trust, fostering growth, and ultimately driving success. And the guide ends with this final tip that I think is just brilliant. It says, practice delivering feedback in role-playing scenarios to build confidence. Over time, it will become second nature.
I love that. It's a reminder that giving effective feedback is a skill, you know? And like any skill, it takes practice to get good at it.
So true. So I guess the challenge for all of us listening today is to think about an upcoming workplace interaction where we might need to give some feedback and consider how we can apply even just one or two of these techniques.
Yeah, even a small adjustment in your language or approach can make a huge difference.
Absolutely. It's all about taking those small steps towards becoming more confident and effective communicators.
And creating a more positive and productive work environment for everyone.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive, but I hope this is giving you some valuable insights and practical tools to help you master the art of giving constructive feedback in English.
Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Until next time.
See you then. Okay, so welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are diving into something that I think is super relevant for just about anyone working in a, global environment, especially anyone working in teams where, maybe English isn't everybody's first language.
No, appreciate it.
It's the power of language to really motivate and inspire people.
Absolutely.
You sent over this really interesting guide, and I think the core mission here is how do we take the best of what we know about language?
Right.
And, use it strategically to, really get our teams humming, get people excited, boost productivity.
Yeah, totally. And what I think is cool about this is this guide is aimed at, advanced English speakers.
Right.
But the stuff in here applies no matter, what language you speak or what your background is.
Totally, yeah.
We're talking real basic human psychology here.
Right.
How do people react to certain ways of communicating?
Yeah, and that's really what we're going to pull out, I think. What are those almost universal levers? That's really what makes this interesting to me. It's less about, perfect grammar and more about, the psychology behind it.
Totally.
How to get a reaction from people. Okay, so first off, the guide lays out a really good foundation, about why words matter so much in a workplace, right? It's not just exchanging info. It's, it's about, building enthusiasm, a sense of shared purpose and, getting people to perform, at their best. It even cites a Harvard Business Review study.
Interesting.
I thought this was really interesting. Leaders who communicate clearly with empathy, with a sense of excitement, they tend to have teams that are way more engaged.
Right. So that direct connection between the leader's communication style and
how the team actually functions.
Yeah, exactly.
How engaged the team is.
Yeah, it's really fascinating.
Okay, so if we take that and zoom out a little bit, the guide talks about some key psychological things that are going on here. For example, have you heard of the Pygmalion effect?
I have, yeah.
So basically, the more you express belief in someone's potential, the more likely they are to rise to the occasion.
Oh yeah, for sure.
So instead of just saying hey, can you put this presentation together? You say something like, I know you've got the skills for this. I'm confident you're going to knock it out of the park.
Yeah.
That person's more likely to actually do a good job.
Absolutely. And they're going to feel more motivated, I think, too.
Right. They feel you actually believe in them. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy almost.
Totally.
And then there's this other concept of emotional contagion.
Oh, yeah. I've heard of this.
It's so wild, basically, our emotions.
That's interesting.
Especially the emotions we communicate, through our language, it can spread to the people around us.
Oh, wow.
So, if you're the leader and you're super pumped up about something. Right.
Even if it's a challenge or if things aren't going well, that energy, it can rub off on the team.
Oh, yeah, totally. And I would guess, on the flip side, if the leader's being really negative all the time.
Oh, yeah.
That's going to affect the team in a bad way.
It totally brings everyone down.
Yeah. So being mindful of the, emotions that you're projecting is so important.
I think so, too. Okay, and then there's verbal reinforcement.
Yeah.
This is huge. I mean, it's the power of recognition and praise.
Oh.
And the guide was really good on this. It's specific praise triggers the release of dopamine, which is the feel-good chemical in your brain, right?
Wow.
So, instead of just saying good job, you say something like, hey, you're, the innovative way you approach that problem, it saved us 2 weeks of work.
Yeah.
And then it's boom, dopamine hit.
Right. So be really specific about the impact.
Super specific.
That their actions had. Yeah, I think this is where, people who are non-native English speakers, it's they might miss some of these opportunities.
Right.
Maybe their language is a little more formal or their praise is kind of general.
Yeah. And I think even for native English speakers, it's so easy to just say good job and move on.
Totally. Yeah.
But taking that extra time to craft a specific compliment can make a huge difference.
Yeah, it's about that emotional connection. And the guide also brings up tone. If your tone is too direct, it can sound harsh.
Yeah.
But then if you're too passive, it can sound like you don't really know what you're doing.
Yeah, it's a tough balance.
It's a tough balance. So I think for, advanced English learners, of course you want to be grammatically correct, but it's you got to go beyond that.
Right.
Think about, is this going to connect on an emotional level?
Yeah. And it's tricky too, because there's so many different cultures represented in global teams these days.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
So just being aware of that is so important.
Okay. So we've talked about the why. Now let's get into the how.
Yeah.
So section 2 of the guide, it's packed with practical stuff.
Awesome.
Phrases you can use, structures, all kinds of things. So let's start with what do you do when your team is facing a tough situation, you know, maybe a project's behind schedule, everyone's stressed out. The guide says, you know, instead of just barking like, we gotta work harder, which is like not helpful at all.
Not at all.
You know, it gives some alternatives like, I know this is tough, but I've seen how resilient this team is. Let's push through this together.
I like that. I like that a lot.
Right. Or, every challenge is an opportunity to grow. Let's tackle this strategically.
Yeah, and I think like the use of we in those phrases
it's so good.
Is so important.
It makes it a team effort.
Yeah, it's not like you guys messed up, now you got to work harder.
It's like we're all in this together. Let's figure it out.
And, you know, you're not like dwelling on the negative. You're saying, okay, this is a chance to learn.
Right.
Let's be smart about this. So, yeah, definitely big takeaway there. Use that we.
Big time.
Okay, next up, recognizing effort and achievement.
Yeah.
We talked about specific praise already, but the guides gives another scenario here. Like, let's say, you know, someone stayed late to like hit a deadline.
Right.
Instead of just, you know, like a bland, thanks for your effort.
Right.
Which, you know.
It's better than nothing.
Yeah, it's fine, but it's not great.
Yeah.
The guide suggests, you know, something like, your dedication is what makes this team exceptional. Thank you for going above and beyond.
Yeah, I like that.
Or, because of your hard work, we've set a new standard for excellence.
Oh, I love that.
Right. It's like, you're really like, you know.
You're not just thanking them, you're like really highlighting the impact that their work had. Yeah, and it's like you're connecting it to the bigger picture, you know? Like, we as a team are better because of what you did.
Exactly.
So the takeaway here is, you know, be specific.
Yeah.
Mention the exact thing that they did.
And you know, like we were talking about before, that's going to give them that like dopamine hit, right? Like they're going to feel so much more valued and appreciated.
Yes. Okay, so what about encouraging innovation?
Ooh, that's a good one.
Right. We all want our teams to be creative, to like, you know, come up with new ideas. But sometimes, you know, you're in a brainstorming session and it's like crickets.
It happens.
So the guide says, you know, skip the we need more ideas.
Right.
That's not helpful.
It's not inspiring, is it?
Not really.
Yeah.
Instead, try something like, no idea is too bold. Let's think outside the box.
Ooh, I like that.
Right. Or your unique perspective is invaluable. What's one unconventional approach we haven't tried?
I love that. So it's like, you know, you're not just saying, give me more ideas.
Yeah.
You're saying like, your ideas are important to me. I want to hear them.
You're making people feel valued, like their perspective matters.
Yeah.
So the action here is use open-ended questions that encourage people to like really think differently.
And not be afraid to like share those kind of like out there ideas.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, now the guide gets into some real-life workplace examples.
Oh, cool.
Which I thought were super helpful. So the first one's about like turning around a demotivated sales team.
Okay.
You know, they've missed their targets like 2 quarters in a row.
Well, that's rough.
Yeah, morale is low. So the ineffective leader might say something like, you know, this performance is unacceptable.
Yeah, that's not going to help.
No.
It's just going to make them feel worse.
Yeah, like you're already feeling bad.
Right.
Don't rub it in. The effective leader, though, they say something like, I believe in this team's potential. Let's analyze what's holding us back and come back stronger.
I like that. Much better.
Right. It's like acknowledging the situation.
Yeah.
But then immediately like shifting to a solution-focused mindset.
Right. And like, again, expressing that belief in the team.
Yeah.
That's so important.
So what happens? Morale improves, and the next quarter, boom, they crush their targets.
I love it.
Yeah. It's like the power of belief. Right.
Totally.
And collaboration. Okay, the second case study is about a high-pressure situation. So we got a software team.
Yeah.
They're facing like a last-minute bug.
Oh, no.
Right before a product launch.
That's stressful.
So stressful.
Yeah.
And the ineffective leader, they just like freak out.
Right.
This has to be fixed now.
Yeah.
Which, you know, I get it.
The pressure's on.
The pressure's on, but that's just going to make everyone panic.
Totally.
The effective leader, they say, I know this is stressful, but if any team can solve this, it's ours. Let's break it down step by step.
That's good. That's good.
Right. So you're acknowledging the stress.
Yeah.
But you're also like instilling confidence.
And providing a way forward.
Yeah. And the team, they stay calm. They fix the bug.
Amazing.
everything launches on time.
Love it.
So what we're seeing here, it's like in both of these cases, it's not about blame or like, just giving orders.
Right.
It's about believing in your team, working together, and having a plan.
And communicating all of that clearly and like in a positive way.
Right. That's what motivating language is all about.
Yeah.
Okay, so now I want to make this super practical for everyone listening, especially our, advanced English speakers who are like really trying to master all these nuances.
Right.
Section 4 of the guide. It's like tips and tricks.
Cool.
Okay, first up, power words.
Oh, I love power words.
So instead of saying, let's try to do better, which is kind of meh.
Yeah.
You say, let's crush our goals this quarter.
Much better.
Right. Like use verbs that are strong, be aspirational.
Yeah.
It makes a huge difference.
It really does.
Yeah.
And it's like, it gets people excited.
Totally.
Like, they're not just going to like try to do better. They're going to crush it.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Next tip, storytelling.
Ooh, storytelling's so powerful.
So powerful. So, maybe you share a brief, anecdote, right? Like maybe it's a personal experience, maybe it's a company success story. The guide gives this example, like when we faced a similar challenge back in 2020, we turned it into our biggest success. Let's do it again.
Oh, that's great. I love that.
Right. It's like you're showing that it's possible. You're giving people hope.
Totally. And I think stories, like, they stick with people.
They did.
It's way more memorable than just like a bunch of data or facts.
Way more memorable. Okay, another crucial point, avoid negative framing.
Right.
So instead of saying, don't make mistakes, which, that's what you're thinking.
Yeah.
But you don't say it that way. You say, focus on delivering your best work.
Yeah. Positive framing all the way.
Yeah. You're shifting the focus from fear of failure to striving for excellence.
Exactly.
And then last but not least, active listening.
Oh, so
this is huge.
nice.
So before you even try to motivate anyone, take the time to understand their concerns. What are they struggling with? And a simple phrase like, I hear that this timeline is tight. How can we support each other?
Yeah, that shows that you're listening.
Yeah.
You care.
You're not just barking orders.
Yeah.
It builds trust. So I think, if we circle back to where we started, for advanced English learners, it's like mastering these nuances, power words, positive framing, active listening.
Yeah.
It's about more than just getting the grammar right.
Right.
It's about really connecting with people.
Totally.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, the key takeaway here, motivating with words.
Yeah.
It's not just about having a big vocabulary. It's about emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
It's about being clear, being authentic, and understanding how your words are going to land with people.
Totally. And anyone can do this.
Absolutely.
Like, no matter what your background is, if you start paying attention to these things, you can become a more inspiring communicator.
100%. And on that note, for everyone listening, here's a challenge for you.
I love it.
Think about a situation coming up where you can use one of these motivational phrases we talked about.
Right.
Try it out. See what happens. Observe the impact it has. What do you notice?
Yeah.
What small changes in your language can really shift the dynamic on your team?
And I think, even if you're not a leader in a formal sense, these are skills that can help you in any kind of collaborative setting. Yeah.
Totally, yeah. Words have so much power.
They do.
And how we choose to use them, it can shape, our whole work environment. It can really impact the people around us.
Yeah.
So hopefully this deep dive has given you some, food for thought, some tools you can start using right away.
Yeah.
And, let's all try to make our workplaces a little bit more positive and inspiring.
Absolutely.
That's it for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Ever get that feeling? Like you're mentally prepping yourself, for one of those tough conversations at work.
Oh, yeah.
The ones I mean, maybe a deadline got missed and it's causing a bit of a domino effect.
Yeah.
Or having to break it to someone that their pet project is getting shelved.
Right.
Or even just dealing with a disagreement you can sense is brewing between team members. I think we've all been there at some point, haven't we? It's just part of working life.
It is. Yeah, it's that realization that something needs to be addressed carefully.
Yeah.
And how you approach those conversations, it really can have a ripple effect, not just in that moment, but on your relationships at work, long term.
For sure. For sure. So for today's deep dive, we're going to be focusing on a really practical skill And that's diplomatic language.
Yeah.
Specifically, in these tricky professional scenarios, we've been digging into some really interesting material that's actually, it's aimed at helping even advanced English speakers really master these conversations. But honestly, the insights are gold for anyone who wants to communicate more effectively at work and build stronger relationships.
Yeah, and what's so interesting is that this isn't just about being polite just for the sake of it.
Right.
There's a real strategic advantage to being able to communicate diplomatically. It can actually help you get your point across and achieve what you want to achieve.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We're talking about preserving relationships, right?
Yeah.
Trust is such a fragile thing.
Oh, yeah.
It's like, a bank account.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Every time you say something harsh, it's like you're making withdrawal.
Uh-huh.
And then it takes a lot of positive interactions to build that back up again.
Makes sense.
It's also about enhancing your professional image, right?
Mm-hmm.
When you can handle tricky situations with grace and tact, people just naturally listen to you more.
For sure.
They respect your opinions.
It builds credibility.
Exactly. It's about building influence. And crucially, it's about nipping misunderstandings in the bud before they snowball into something bigger.
Yeah.
Using clear diplomatic language just reduces those chances of confusion and those emotional flare-ups that none of us want.
Definitely. So let's unpack this a bit. When we say diplomatic language, what are we actually talking about? What does that look like?
So fundamentally, it's about minimizing that potential for conflict, keeping that sense of mutual respect and making sure your message gets across without causing offense or unnecessary friction.
Right.
It's like a balancing act, really.
It is. It's like walking a tightrope almost.
Yes.
You've got different priorities to consider.
Gracefully.
And there are a few key elements that help us walk that tightrope. One is softening those direct statements.
Okay.
So instead of just coming out and saying something very bluntly,
Yeah.
you find ways to phrase things a bit more gently. Another is using indirect language when, being direct could feel a bit too confrontational.
Okay.
And as you mentioned, it's this constant dance between being honest, because you still need to communicate the necessary information, but doing it in a way that's polite and considers the other person's feelings.
Right. And a huge part of it, I think, is consciously avoiding blame.
Oh, yeah.
And those accusatory tones that just immediately make someone feel defensive. And that shuts down the whole conversation before it even really starts.
Exactly. And if we think back to those benefits that we talked about,
Right.
you can really see how these all fit together.
Yeah.
Softening your language, not pointing fingers.
Mm-hmm.
This directly helps protect those relationships because people don't feel attacked.
Right.
They're more open to talking.
Yeah.
Being honest but polite, this boosts your professional image. It shows that you're a thoughtful, mature communicator.
Yeah.
And being clear and tactful, this naturally reduces misunderstandings because you're choosing your words carefully to avoid ambiguity or triggering someone emotionally.
Makes sense. Okay, let's bring this to life with some real-world situations.
Okay.
Because I think that's where it really clicks.
Yeah.
For people listening,
Yeah, for sure.
we've all had to deal with performance issues, haven't we?
Oh, absolutely.
At some point.
Yep.
So let's say you've got a team member who consistently misses deadlines.
Okay.
What's a non-diplomatic way that conversation might go?
Well, unfortunately, a common but ineffective way would be something like, "You're always late with your reports. This is unacceptable."
Oh, wow. Yeah, you can almost feel the hackles rising just hearing that. What's so problematic about that kind of statement?
Well, first off, always is a very strong word.
Yeah.
And it's rarely actually true.
Right.
It instantly puts the other person on the defensive.
Uh-huh.
It feels like a personal attack rather than focusing on the behavior. And unacceptable, that's such a loaded word,
Yeah.
It's so judgmental. It shuts down any chance of a productive conversation about how to actually improve things.
Yeah.
It just focuses on the negative without offering any solutions or empathy.
Okay, so thinking about how you could handle this differently.
Right.
What would a more diplomatic way to address that same issue look like?
The material we looked at actually suggests something like, "I've noticed some delays with the recent reports. Let's discuss how we can improve timelines going forward."
Yeah, that feels so much better already.
Yeah.
What are those key differences that make this approach so much more effective?
Well, there are a few things I've noticed is much softer, right? It's just an observation.
Yeah.
It's not an accusation.
Right.
It's focused on the facts rather than attacking their character or work ethic.
Yeah.
And that second part, let's discuss how we can improve timelines going forward. That's crucial.
Okay.
Because it shifts the focus. It turns it into a problem to be solved together.
Right.
It invites them to be part of the solution.
Yeah, and the resources we've been looking at, they highlight some really helpful phrases you can use in these kinds of situations.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
So instead of jumping straight to, something very direct, you could say something like, I wanted to check in on.
Yeah, it's a good way to open a conversation about something a bit sensitive.
Yeah, or I've observed that.
Right, again, focusing on what you've seen rather than being judgmental.
Okay.
And then to really get that collaboration going, how can we work together to resolve this?
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, let's shift gears to another tough situation. Delivering bad news.
Yeah.
Let's say there's a project a team's been really pouring their hearts into, and it suddenly gets canceled.
Oh, that's tough.
How might that news be delivered in a very non-diplomatic way?
It could be something really blunt, like, the project's canceled, there's nothing we can do.
Oof, talk about a punch in the gut.
Right.
What makes that approach so problematic for you?
Well, it's just so direct, and it completely lacks any empathy for the team, for all their hard work, their enthusiasm, and their likely disappointment, there's nothing we can do, is so dismissive.
Right.
It sounds final.
Yeah.
It doesn't leave any room for discussion or even acknowledging how this will affect the team or their efforts.
Okay, so if you were the one having to deliver this news, how could you do it more diplomatically?
Okay, so a more thoughtful, more diplomatic approach would be, after careful consideration, we've decided to discontinue the project. We understand this may be disappointing, and we're here to discuss next steps.
Okay, that's so much better.
Yeah.
What are those key elements that make that phrasing so much more sensitive to how the team's feeling?
Okay, so after careful consideration, that shows that the decision wasn't made lightly. It wasn't impulsive. We've decided. It's a clear statement of fact.
Right.
But it avoids blaming any one person or team. And then, crucially, we understand this may be disappointing. That acknowledges their feelings.
Yeah.
It shows empathy. It validates their emotions.
Okay.
And we're here to discuss next steps. That offers support. It provides a path forward.
Right, so it's not just leaving them hanging with that bad news.
Exactly.
And again, those resources we've been looking at, they point out some really valuable phrases you can use in these situations.
Oh, definitely.
So things like, after reviewing the situation.
Right, it suggests a deliberate process.
Yeah.
We regret to inform you that.
Oh.
That acknowledges the news is negative.
Yeah.
But it keeps it professional.
Right.
And this one's so important. We appreciate your hard work, and we'll support you through this transition.
Yeah.
Because you want to recognize their efforts and offer your support during what will likely be a difficult time for them.
Okay, let's tackle another common workplace challenge.
Yeah.
Conflicts between colleagues. Let's say you've got two team members who are constantly butting heads over who's responsible for what.
Right.
What's a really non-diplomatic way a manager might step into that situation?
Oh, it could be something like, you two need to stop fighting and figure it out.
Ooh, that sounds dismissive.
Yeah.
Like it's just brushing the whole thing under the rug.
It is. It is. It doesn't get to the root of the problem.
Yeah.
It doesn't offer any guidance or support, and it can leave those individuals feeling unheard and like their manager doesn't care enough to help.
So putting yourself in that manager's shoes, what would a more diplomatic and constructive way to approach that tension look like?
It could be something like, I can see there's some tension here. Let's take a step back and clarify roles to avoid any future misunderstandings.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
Because it acknowledges the situation, right?
Yeah.
But without blaming anyone or taking sides.
Exactly. I can see there's some tension here. That's just an observation.
Okay.
It's not a judgment. Let's take a step back. That suggests a calm, considered approach and clarify roles to avoid future misunderstandings. That's about finding a proactive solution, rather than just telling them to stop arguing.
Okay, so what are some key phrases you might use in your own conversations to navigate those kinds of team conflicts?
Well, I sense there's some disagreement is a gentle way to start.
Okay.
Then, to show you want to find a solution together, let's find a middle ground.
Right.
And to really emphasize that everyone needs to be on board, how can we move forward in a way that works for everyone?
Makes sense. Okay, last scenario, and I think this is one a lot of people listening will relate to. saying no politely.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
We've all been there, haven't we? Swamped with work. And someone asks for just one more favor.
Oh, yeah.
What's that non-diplomatic, maybe even a bit abrupt way to respond?
Well, the classic one is, I can't help you, I'm too busy.
Yes, straight to the point, but maybe not so good for the relationship.
Yeah, gets the message across.
Yeah.
But it can come off as dismissive.
Right.
And unhelpful.
Yeah.
And that could damage the relationship with that colleague.
Okay, so when you're up to your eyeballs in work,
Right.
how can you decline a request diplomatically, but still keep things positive with your colleague?
A more considerate way would be, I'd love to assist, but my current workload is pretty heavy. Maybe mentioning another colleague who could help, or a later timeline would work.
Oh, that's much better.
Yeah.
You're still setting a boundary, but you're offering alternatives.
Exactly. I'd love to assist. That softens the no.
Yes.
It shows you had good intentions.
Right.
My current workload is pretty heavy. That's a clear reason without making excuses.
Yeah.
And then suggesting another colleague or a different timeline shows you're still trying to be helpful.
So what are some good phrases to keep in mind when you need to say no politely?
So something like, I appreciate you reaching out, but that acknowledges their initiative.
Right.
Then at this time, I'm unable to commit due to...
That gives a reason without being too specific or negative.
Okay.
And let me suggest an alternative.
Right.
That shows you're still trying to help.
Okay, so we've gone through some specific tricky scenarios and how to handle them diplomatically.
Yep.
Let's zoom out a bit now.
Okay.
And look at some broader key strategies for diplomatic communication that you can use in just about any professional interaction.
Sounds good.
So one of the most fundamental strategies is to use softening language.
Oh, yeah.
What does that look like in everyday workplace conversations?
Instead of making really strong statements that could sound confrontational, you can use phrases like, it seems like.
Right.
That presents an observation.
Okay.
Rather than stating something as absolute fact.
Yeah.
Or, I might be mistaken, but that shows humility.
Right.
And invites discussion. Even a simple, perhaps we could consider when you're suggesting an idea.
Yeah.
That can be much more diplomatic than a direct order. So it's about creating that space for dialogue.
Absolutely.
And not sounding like you're challenging someone.
Exactly. Another really powerful technique is to switch your language to focus on we instead of you when you're talking about problems or solutions.
How does that small change in pronoun actually affect the conversation?
It's huge. Think about how it feels to hear, you didn't follow the process.
Yeah.
That sounds like you're being blamed.
Right.
But if you say, let's realign on the process to ensure consistency across the team,
Okay.
now it's a shared understanding. It's a team effort.
Right.
So for those listening, think about how you can rephrase some of the feedback you give
Yeah.
and use we instead of you.
That's a really good tip, yeah.
Yeah.
And then there's the classic sandwich technique for feedback.
Yeah, the sandwich.
Classic for a reason, right?
It is. It just makes it easier to hear constructive criticism.
Okay, for anyone who's not familiar, can you break down how the sandwich technique works?
Sure. So you structure your feedback in 3 parts.
Okay.
You start with a positive comment.
Right.
Then you give the constructive feedback. And then you finish with something encouraging or supportive. The idea is to cushion the criticism with positive things.
Got it.
So it's easier to swallow.
Okay, can you give us an example? Like how you might use it in a real situation at work?
Sure. Let's go back to that missed deadline example.
Okay.
You could say something like, I really appreciate your dedication to this project. That's the positive part. Then, one area we could improve is sticking to the agreed upon timelines.
Okay.
That's the constructive feedback.
Right.
And then finish with, I'm confident that with a little more focus in this area, your contributions will be even more impactful.
That's good.
So you see how it softens the blow.
Yeah, it feels much more like guidance and less like a personal attack.
Exactly. And then another really important strategy for diplomatic communication is to ask open-ended questions.
Okay, what are some examples of questions that can really get that conversation flowing?
Questions that encourage people to share their thoughts and perspectives. So instead of saying, do you understand this approach? You could ask, what are your thoughts on this approach?
Okay.
Or instead of, is there a problem? You could say, how do you see the situation unfolding?
Got it. So you're inviting them to really engage in the conversation.
Exactly. It's about having a two-way dialogue, not just giving information.
Now, it's really important to keep in mind that what's considered diplomatic can vary quite a bit across different English-speaking cultures.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's super relevant in today's diverse workplaces.
Definitely.
So can you give us some examples of those cultural nuances in communication?
Sure. So in the US and Canada, communication tends to be pretty direct.
Okay.
But still polite.
Right.
So you might hear things like, I'd suggest.
Okay.
It's a suggestion, but it doesn't sound too forceful.
Right.
Whereas in the UK and Australia, things can be a bit more indirect, with more focus on implied meaning. So you might hear something like, perhaps we might consider.
Yeah.
Which is much softer, more tentative.
And what about when you're working with colleagues from Asia, particularly in those multinational settings?
That's where cultural awareness is really key.
Okay.
In many Asian cultures, communication has a lot of context, meaning that a lot of the message is conveyed through nonverbal cues and shared understanding.
Right.
So you have to be really good at reading between the lines,
Okay.
paying attention to body language, tone of voice.
Yeah.
Even silence can mean different things. It can indicate disagreement or discomfort.
Right.
So being aware of these cultural differences is essential for effective communication.
Absolutely, especially as our professional networks become increasingly global.
Exactly. So to sum it all up, mastering diplomatic language is a really valuable skill to have.
It is.
It's not just about being polite. It's a strategic way to navigate tricky situations and build strong relationships at work.
We've looked at a whole range of scenarios, right?
Yeah.
Performance issues, bad news, conflicts, saying no. We've talked about specific phrases to use and broader strategies like softening your language and focusing on we instead of you.
Exactly. And don't forget those cultural nuances.
Right.
They're so important for making sure your message is understood.
So for those listening, think about the strategies we've discussed today.
Yeah.
And how you can apply them to your own professional interactions. Maybe there's a conversation you've been putting off because it's tricky.
Right.
Think about how using these approaches could help you handle it more smoothly.
And here's a final thought to leave you with.
Okay.
Think about how consistently using diplomatic language doesn't just help you in those isolated situations. It actually helps create a more positive, more collaborative, and ultimately less stressful work environment.
Yeah, that's so important.
Think about the long-term impact on your career
Right.
and your relationships.
Makes you think.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah, food for thought.